This is the story of a normal young man who comes into possession of incredible powers. It's the story of his struggle to fit in, of his battles with the hatred, the prejudices, the violence of a world that rejects him. It begins on an island. Our hero wants only to live a normal life, to be anonymous, unknown, to grow up beyond the glare of the public eye. But the public eye is fiery and all-seeing, and our hero finds himself set upon by baying crowds and has to fight his way out.
Learn it? Did you want to fight? Is that the deal? Whoa, bro. Fight?
He goes to a friend's house where he believes that he's hidden. He thinks he's found some peace and solitude in the turbulent world, but then that friend turns against him, and once again, he finds himself fighting to survive.
Ezra at my house right now. We have been offering our home to him, and he came into our room and he's threatening us right now. He hit me in the head with a chair, and I'm gushing out.
Our hero runs across the world. He runs, he's so fast. They can never catch him, but they're never far behind. Inexorably, he attracts the attention of villains more powerful than that bitch he choked out at the beginning of our tale. Undercover, hiding in a bar, trying to drink and forget, he's set upon by the first of many powerful antagonists, a woman with a voice so terrible he has no choice but to silence her for the good of everyone around him. He saved many people that day, but they do not understand what he sacrificed for them. No one does. Tricked by the foul-singing witch, they believe he's assaulted an innocent woman and they drive him out. The press, secretly run by corrupt men in league with sinister forces, hounds him. He's portrayed as a monster.
If y'all want to die, I suggest just yourselves with your own guns. Okay? Otherwise, keep doing exactly what you're doing right now, and you know what I'm talking about. And then, we'll do it for you if that's really what you want. Okay, talk to you soon, okay? Bye!
The whole town turns against him, and yet again he finds himself fighting and running to survive. Innocent people get hurt in his battles with evil, and he's blamed for their injuries and deaths, so he had no choice.
I present people always.
Hi.
And always just knock you out, and then you won't have to panic.
Right, you just gotta knock
You just
people
let me
out.
know.
Yeah.
No? Yes?
What?
And he feels so alone. All he does is run and run and run some more. His powers are growing, but so too is his isolation. He fears he's losing control, that he's turning into the very monster the world already believes him to be. But then, out of the blue, he finds hope. Hope in the form of another outcast, a boy, one person among all the billions of nameless faces who understands what it's like to be him. Theirs, though, is a forbidden love, and the two must flee the boy's parents and their piddling restraining order, but all is well, for they run together, and for the first time they've each found companionship. Eventually all falls to doom again, and our hero loses the boy, but not the lessons he's learned along the way. There are others out there, others like him, and though his life may be a burden, he can alleviate that by finding meaning in helping others like him find refuge. He establishes a haven, a place for the poor and downtrodden, the dispossessed and the abandoned, to come and to be safe, to live and thrive away from the cruel outside. In the end, the forces of evil find this hidden paradise and they attack.
Assaulted in this bar twice in a row. I film myself when I get assaulted for NFT crypto art. What's your name? What's your badge number?
But by now, our hero has grown strong. He's mastered his powers. All his years of running have made him tougher and faster than any god. And he taps the full extent of his potential, running so fast that he breaks the fabric of reality itself. He exists now and forevermore outside the bounds of time, outside the laws of the universe. He is no longer an individual, no longer a man, now he is all things, a plurality of beings, unconstrained by the binary rules of existence.
I'm sorry, I'm not a sir, I'm transgender, non-binary, please never refer to me as sir, it's not okay right here.
Okay. I was just trying to be respectful.
If you fail to do that again, that is an act of intentional bigotry and it is a technical hate crime according to U.S. federal law. Please call me they, them, theirs, you can use the term mix.
He is not he anymore, he is they. There is no him, there is them.
I claim my Fourth Amendment rights to not be unlawful. Hey, you just touched my penis. Please don't do that. I'm not transgender, non-binary. I don't want to be searched by a man. I'm transgender, non-binary, and I don't want to be searched by a man. I claim my Fourth Amendment rights.
And so the legend goes, if you find yourself beset by the forces of darkness, if evil comes at you with restraining orders and charges of petty theft and violent misdemeanor and indecent exposure and kidnapping and drug use and starting weird cults in Icelandic Airbnbs, all you have to do is run. Run and run and keep on running. Run so fast that you leave reality behind you. Run until you too become part of the great plurality. There may be no hope in man or in woman, but in them we trust. That sadly is not the story of The Flash. It's much more interesting than the story of The Flash. All of the above is in fact a dramatic repurposing of the story of one Ezra Matthew Miller, with the twist being that the hero of my imagining has something like a moral arc, while its inspiration will either soar or hang based on the money arc, because Hollywood doesn't really do morals. For what it's worth, there's a tiny bit of me, just a tiny little bit of me, that feels some genuine sympathy for Ezra Miller. 1 misdemeanor might be an accident, 2 could be a coincidence, 3 is a pattern, and half a dozen is something rather more than carelessness. Mental health issues do, of course, exist.
At least you can feel it in your hands what you're doing. Ezra, don't pick up the hair. Ezra, put it in the garbage.
But spirals often stem from a lack of intervention early on. The crimes of Ezra Miller are well known and admitted to. The tragedy of Ezra Miller is that a young man could commit so many of them without the intervention of friends, family, and loved ones. It probably shouldn't take multiple allegations of grooming minors and running cults out of Airbnbs like you're shooting Fear and Loathing in Reykjavik for someone somewhere to step in and try to stop you. Understanding cause does not entail excuse-making for consequence, but it can, just perhaps, shine a bit more light on an industry with a long record of taking bright young things and turning them into monsters. By focusing all of your ire on Ezra Miller, you are arguably letting the studio off the hook. I include all this at the beginning because I know quite a few people who simply won't go and see The Flash because they don't want to be seen or to think themselves supporting Miller and the studio that's kept him in employment. This conversation's been fleshed out a few times. We've discussed it on The Best Show in the Universe Probably, the podcast I run on Monday nights with the Movie Cynic, and on Mr. Brown Alliance, where I'm often a guest on Sundays. It's a perfectly understandable reaction, and as a consumer, your wallet is probably more impactful than any vote you have ever cast or ever will. I don't know that the position is especially well developed. I'm not sure very many people are going back and snapping their DVDs because Harvey Weinstein is listed as a producer, for example, or shunning the very many well-known stars who worked with him and could at least be supposed to have some knowledge of his low moral character.
So I just want to thank my agent, Kevin Uvain, and God, Harvey Weinstein.
I do not require consistency of anybody. We're all large, we contain multitudes. But I do encourage it, and if we are to take this moral line, I don't see any reason to constrain it to this production alone. If you're boycotting The Flash, you should probably boycott the whole studio, and then indeed most of Hollywood, because you can be pretty damn sure they are all connected in some way. For myself, happily, I'm a reviewer, and that means I have no morals, I have aesthetics. That's only half a joke, but I am wholly a devotee of aesthetic autonomism. We can have these conversations and arguments about Miller's actions and the moral character of the film industry as a whole, but that's an entirely different magisteria to the question of art itself. What Ezra Miller did or did not do in real life has no bearing on whether any given film starring Ezra Miller is good as a film or as a work of art. Liberal arts is a triumph of civilization, and it took a damned long time and many sacrifices to achieve it. It is not so long in the grand scheme of things, since Oscar Wilde was sent to prison because society and the law deemed his private moral character and the nebulous morality of his works to be entirely coterminous. Art condemned for personal vice, art as evidence of personal vice. We are living in an increasingly illiberal age. A fairly large chunk of the audience knows how to hate cancel culture when the other side engages in it. Artists from Gina Carano to Graham Linehan have all been set upon by the illiberal left. The danger is that this creates a resurgence of the illiberal streak in the right, which is historically just as good at cancelling people as the culture commies are. I'm not addressing either side specifically with this part of the video, I'm making a point applicable to both. By all means, vote with your wallet, but the moment I'm told that I am morally wrong to be evaluating a work of art because of its proximity to an unpopular person, I will tell you to fuck off. It's regrettable we even need to have this particular conversation. The causes are more and more common, though. We look at Ezra Miller and say, damn, that's some pretty disgusting stuff right there. And then reliably Marvel says, hold my Bud Light, we've got 2 of them. Allegedly. But at least it's an opportunity to dust off some of the old principles we have been in danger of forgetting. If you discard a principle because the case happens to be tough, then it probably wasn't a principle to begin with. So consider this part of the video my contribution to the housework. I'm all for criticizing casting decisions, I am all for condemning an industry that sacrifices morality for monetary concerns, I am all for criticizing what Ezra Miller has done in his private life, I'll take the piss out of him a lot during this video. But that is all separate to the evaluation of the art that that industry and that individual has produced. One final housekeeping concern, Ezra Miller is famously part of the LGBT drop-down menu community, so there's the inevitable questions of pronouns to address. I like to think I'm a pretty liberal guy in the classical sense. I'm not straight, I know trans people, I have my disagreements with activists from that category, and I am skeptical of gender as a concept, but life is not a purely academic proposition, and people are interesting for who they are as well as for what they think. I draw a soft line after the B, I draw a hard line after the T. At most, I think we should close the LGBT acronym off with an N for narcissistic, to encompass all the exciting varieties of self-obsession that now march under the progress pride flag. Ezra Miller believes that Ezra Miller is very special, but they/them pronouns are grammar's equivalent of war crimes, so I will be as accommodating as possible and proceed with the twat/twat self pronouns where necessary.
Please call me they, them, their.
Now then, ladies and gentlethems, I give you The Flash. By the by, I know some of you precious little darling Snyder fans are very upset that the Jesus of DC never got to finish the story of your wet dreams. And part of me sincerely sympathizes, because quite apart from anything else, had Snyder helmed the entire DCU, you would have had a much harder time finding ways to deflect the blame for its poor quality. But to smooth things over, to give you just a flavor of the familiar, to make you feel at home, I have decided to present this video in Snyder Vision. So yes, the film that follows might be awfully written, it might make dangerously little sense, but at least it'll have the holy aspect ratio of Zachary, bathed in its 4:3 goodness. We kick off with the Flash trying to buy a sandwich. Ezra Miller's real-life issues aside, Twat's artistic problems come from the decision, whether by Twat or somebody else, to portray this version of Barry Allen as an insufferably twitchy and neurotically intense Joker who's quite often just uncomfortable to watch, a bit like Tweak from South Park, all jacked up on his parents' coffee, but without any of the charm or the humor. He's at the sandwich store to get much-needed calories, because he burns through calories at an astonishing rate. However, the girl who's normally there with his sandwich readily prepared for him is off today, meaning that he's running out of calories. He has an Apple Watch, it tells him how many calories are in his body. Totally possible, don't ask questions. And there is no goddamned sandwich. I cannot convey to you the intense burning need he has for this sandwich, which is a shame, because it's vital to the film's opening acts, though it then becomes entirely irrelevant for the rest of the film, so I guess it doesn't matter too much after all. Instead of the usual girl, the guy serving him is a slow, slightly sardonic talker, and if you forget the fact that the film is here establishing a vital mechanic that it won't ever use again after its opening set piece, this contrast between them isn't a terrible idea. Flash himself remains pretty insufferable, but the film is at least aware that he's insufferable, which can't be said either for Justice League or Zack Snyder's new addition to the Bible. It's quite far from hilarious, but by putting Flash opposite someone whose entire personality is designed to drain his neurotic buzz, it makes him more tolerable in turn, even if the scene, which yeah, is supposed to drag, don't get me wrong, nevertheless drags on far too long. There are two ticking clocks in play already at this point in the film. The first is Flash's desperate need for calories, the second and related one comes from Alfred, who calls to explain that Batman needs help taking down some criminals who've stolen some terrible bioweapon and also, for reasons I honestly can't remember, created a sinkhole under the local children's hospital, which is about to collapse. Now, efficiency is not the be-all and end-all of writing. I'm contractually obliged to say that because I make incredibly long videos. But efficiency is important, not least for ensuring narrative devices are given their proper weight and attention. Unless it's a very deliberate choice that's woven into the story for a reason, you do not generally need two ticking clocks. An example of two ticking clocks aiding the story would be, say, The Dark Knight, where clocks are ticking down simultaneously on both Rachel and Harvey Dent. That works because the two devices are telling the same time, presenting competing and mutually exclusive goals for the protagonist. You can save one of them if you hurry, you cannot save both. The Flash's two ticking clocks do not do this. It's questionable whether there's any kind of narrative need for them at all, really. His sole mission is, as Alfred explains, to go and mop up while Batman pursues the criminals with the evil death virus. This itself is a problem because these guys are fleeing in a van and Batman has to drive after them on a bike. Know what power set might be incredibly useful? Running at super speed. So why are they not, like, reversing their roles here? Have Batman stay and save people because speed is not quite so important there. Have the Flash go after the evil criminals because they cannot possibly outrun him? Anyway, on the 2 ticking clocks, there's an issue mostly with payoff though, rather than setup. The first scene creates the 2 clocks, one literal on his wrist counting calorie depletion, and the other figurative, getting to the crime scene in time to do his duty. The tension at play is that he needs calories to use his powers, and he needs his powers to do his duty, meaning he needs this sandwich before he can help Batman, and the sandwich just isn't coming. But as mentioned, beyond this opening sequence, the calorie clock will entirely disappear. It's simply not operative for the rest of the film. Flash is shown using all these same powers without sustenance being a major driving motive. You can tell me, yeah, but a film where he has to constantly go looking for food would be really boring. And I might agree with you, but then I probably wouldn't have used this mechanic in the first instance. And while it is primarily a problem with an absent payoff, there's a setup issue as well. Eventually running out of time to wait for his sandwich, Flash goes to a bathroom. He puts on his suit, he runs out into the street sans sandwich, making ready to run despite being low on calories. He's spotted by a bunch of passing teenagers who freak out because they're big fans of the Flash, owing to the fame and reputation he has presumably accrued off-screen, it not having been set up in any preceding film. One of the teenagers is eating what Americans insist on calling a candy bar, and which I'll call a candy bar because I don't know what specific type of bar it is. Flash asks for it, he's given it, so he gets his calorie boost. But if the calorie deficit is a major and known impediment to his powers, why doesn't he just carry candy bars with him wherever he goes? That seems like a pretty simple, straightforward and logical solution to a known problem, and he's supposed to be clever enough to foresee problems like this. Even if you say, as the film does not, that he's too flippant and in the moment and generally erratic to plan ahead like this, the premise of this opening sequence is that he works with people who are not so flippant and in the moment and generally erratic as he is. He works closely with both Batman and Alfred, who are shown equipping him with certain technology and possessions later on. The director has previously confirmed that it was Bruce who made the Flash's new suit in the first place, and here we have an issue that goes deep into the pre-gun DCU, which is a relative lack of realized character relationships and world building and all of the rest. I have to chuck all this stuff in here, by the way, because the film isn't going to spend much time in this particular era. One of the strengths of this part of the film is that, uniquely from the existing DCU, it does kind of acknowledge that, yeah, these characters have lives and relationships with each other off the screen. Whereas Snyder's Bible cut didn't go much further than, yeah, well, Bruce unites the Justice League. That's where we leave it off, really. Here, though, we're seeing precisely what that means and what he has to offer them. He is, to use a comparison DC stans might not like, hinted as being the Tony Stark of the Justice League, which makes perfect sense, frankly. I kinda like that. I like that the film kicks off showing us how the Flash, Batman, and Alfred work together to take on, well, I was going to say local threats. It's portrayed in the film as a local threat of the week type thing. You just kind of have to ignore that they've stolen a virus that's said to be a globe-ending megaplague, but you know, it's not relevant to the rest, so who really cares about that? But because this is the first time the DCU has managed to show us this sort of working relationship, it doesn't have much history to draw on, and it's pretty sketchy about the history it's having to invent. It's absolutely believable, and it's the best decision to have the Flash's suit made by Bruce. That's fine. But whereas Tony Stark's inventions for the other heroes in the MCU carry some of his character, both his stylistic flair and his tech wizardry and resourcefulness, Bruce's Flash suit is simply said to be the suit Bruce made, but carries none of his character with it. Are you really telling me, film, that Bruce Wayne, one of the most resourceful and strategically adept of all the heroes, wouldn't have accounted for Flash's need for frequent calorie boosts? That he'd give him this high-tech calorie-counting watch, but nothing so simple as pockets full of candy bars to boost the calories the watch is supposed to be counting? That, combined with the eventual redundancy of the calorie mechanic, suggests that this particular ticking clock was really only put in place as an excuse for humor, which is a criticism we are used to making of the latter-day MCU. But if you are going to include humor even at the cost of bearing many mistakes, it has to be really quite funny, and the sandwich threat just isn't. The phrase sandwich threat is actually much funnier than the sandwich threat in the film. But anyway, having been given his momentary sugar boost, the Flash sprints off down the street.
Ever besmirch Billy Joel.
Yeah, the boys was funnier. Anyway, he zooms off through the streets to arrive in a flash get it, at the hospital, where the sinkhole of uncertain provenance has just opened. He has to go around saving people from the collapse. It's not unlike the way he saved people a few times using super speed in Justice League and the Bible Cut, and I wonder if there's a reason I've mentioned that. I guess you'll have to wait and see. Which is another way of saying yes, the film is definitely going to fuck this up later, just trust me. While Flash saves people from the sinkhole, Bruce hops on his Batbike and goes chasing after the criminals who have the Megadeth virus. Bruce is not shown to have very much situational or threat awareness during this chase. At one point, the criminal's van is hurtling down the road towards some school children crossing the street, and Bruce's response to this is to fire a projectile stinger device, which passes beneath the van and spreads itself out between it and the children. Now, anyone who's ever watched any sort of police chase video knows what stingers like that tend to do. In the first place, they are meant to be kind of hard to spot. In the second place, the consequence of hitting them tends to be a quite dramatic loss of control over the fleeing vehicle, because it's just had all of its tires wrecked while traveling at high speed. Now, this is a tricky situation for Batman, don't get me wrong, but I'm not sure his use of the stinger here actually makes the situation better, except of course that the writers can contrive the least likely of all possible outcomes and avoid running over the children. Absent the stinger, the criminals likely remain in control of their vehicle. They've got a clear view of the road ahead. I'd wager they likely try and avoid the children crossing the road, not only because they might have that rudimentary morality that makes running people over generally undesirable, unless they're, Jehovah's Witnesses or something, but, and more likely, because hitting any kind of obstruction is undesirable. They don't want to be slowed down. They don't want to risk losing control of their vehicle. So on balance, they'd probably try to avoid a throng of innocent people, or at least target a thin section of the crowd and minimize the damage they do. Still pretty bad, you might argue, but then consider the opposite. Bruce fires the stinger, they don't see it in time, which is, after all, part of its design. Rather than being able to choose to avoid the crossing children entirely, or else to avoid the larger group, they instead lose control of their van and end up careening straight through all the kiddies, resulting in the criminals' capture and at the cost of a great many deaths. On top of which, they are said to be carrying the evil suitcase of Megadeth, and Bruce will later be shown being very concerned that this thing not be damaged or dropped into a body of water, for example, and yet he's just taken a very risky course of action which could well have seen the van have its tires popped and overturn and the suitcase spill open and everybody dies. Say, would it be really, really helpful maybe to use the guy who has super speed to sort of run in front of it, Bruce? Might that have been a better decision? In the event, they do see the stinger and they do choose to change direction, but I think that has to go down as rather fucking lucky and against the stinger's design principles. I moan about this because Batman is supposed to be resourceful, clever, with a large arsenal of weapons and gadgets at his disposal, and the Flash is supposed to be incredibly quick and able to outrun virtually any fleeing thing. So Bruce shouldn't have to rely on luck to avoid aiding the slaughter of lots of children. And quite apart from the children, he knows the criminals are carrying a deadly pathogen in a briefcase that he's about to be very concerned not to damage, so is there absolutely nothing he or the Flash could or would have done besides this gamble? In the event, of course, it is a moot point, because the criminals do see the stinger and do divert down a side road, and they don't accidentally crash, leading to the slaughter of children and then a worldwide plague thereafter. Meanwhile, the Flash has been pissing about in the sinkhole, fixing cables and pipes to stop gas leaks or something, and moaning about being hungry. However, what he believes to be the rumbling of his stomach transpires to be the collapse of the children's wing of the hospital, which you'd think would be a terrifying thing even to a superhero, given the stakes involved. And terrifying to the Flash in particular, given he knows that he is dangerously low on the fuel he would need to save people from this disaster. So what does he do? As he sees the hospital collapse and actual babies start falling out of windows and such? Well, he cracks a few jokes, as you do, first about being hungry, and then about, and I quote, a baby shower. And it's generally one of the weirdest relationships I've ever had with a joke. On the one hand, it is so context specific that you have to kind of applaud them for the construction of it. On the other hand, we're seeing babies fall out of the windows of a collapsing maternity ward, and he is quipping. Look, I have a pretty dark sense of humor. I'm an equal opportunities offender. I can't use half the shit I find funny because YouTube's TOS won't allow it. But even I felt a slight moral ick factor at play here, and I think largely because the film doesn't seem to think there's any shock value to exploit in this setup. There are jokes that work because they are shocking, and though you really should be sparing with them because shock requires scarcity, they are a legitimate form of humor. Think Frankie Boyle's early stuff.
Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Whatever it is, it's heading straight for the World Trade Center.
before he started getting paid by The Guardian and the BBC, and subsequently yoinked up the ladder he himself used to climb to success. If he'd ever had a true international reputation, his transition from scarifier to woke scold would have been one of the more remarkable examples of its type. But this film jokes about babies falling to their presumed deaths from a collapsing maternity ward with a kind of eerie, Marvel-like weightlessness to it that's made more incongruous because we've just finished with a scene where the Flash running low on calories was portrayed as a serious impediment to action. On top of which, the director chooses this moment to huff on Zack Snyder's crack pipe and give us a long slow-motion shot of shards of glass falling toward babies, and glasses of poison falling toward babies, and general pain and discomfort falling toward babies who are already falling to their deaths.
Dude, this is pretty f***ed up right here.
And look, I have shat all over Marvel for its balked humor, but I can't think of a single MCU joke that is more tonally balked than slow-mo shots of babies about to be stabbed by broken glass before splatting onto the pavement en masse. I'll not say there's no way it could have been funny, I just can't think of a way to make it funny, and the film doesn't make it funny, it's just kind of gross. And I laughed at the Stick of Truth's Nazi zombie fetuses, I laughed a lot at that. Something about him putting a baby in a microwave just isn't quite as good. The scene being slow-mo makes the joke slow-mo too, of course, so Flash at first ignores the babies and leaps for the vending machine, which at least works because he gets jacked up on sugar, and this enables him to save the falling babies via his heightened calorie count. The CGI is, questionable. There are ways to smooth the difference between live action and CGI. Going straight from one CGI baby in a microwave to that same baby in live action out of a microwave is pretty much the opposite of those ways. Not something you should be doing. He not only saves the babies, he saves their nurse as well. Which is an opportunity for another joke that is either knowing or unintentionally prophetic.
I understand that these events can be psychologically scarring. You should seek the services of a mental health professional. The Justice League is not very good at that part yet. Trust me.
And I really want this to be knowing, because unlike the dying babies, that would genuinely be quite funny. But, and I don't know if this is a compliment, the film has had so much trouble in production that you really can't tell what's been added in reshoots and what was there from the off. That's largely because the CGI generally looks like a PS3 game designed by an idiot, so Lord of Ring Gollum for comparison. Kind of clever, I guess. If you make all of it look rushed, you can't tell which bits genuinely were. I'm gonna choose to believe that joke was knowing because it makes it by far the most satirically brilliant thing in the film. And because, contrary to popular impression, I really do want these films to be good when I'm criticizing them. Moving on, Bruce is still chasing the criminals in the van. This isn't coming across very well in my script because I see part of the function of reviews like this as being to break the J.J. Abrams directing model of make it fast enough and no one will notice. But this film has been dialed up to 11 from its first minute, and it's rarely going to spend much time below an 8 on the pace scale. This can have its merits. It's not the most artful deployment of contrast, but it does understand the basic value of contrast. The Flash is clearly meant to be a simple crowd pleaser. What do we want that we've had too little of? Superheroes doing superhero things, uncomplicated by the writer's political fads and obsessions. Much like with Transformers or the Monsterverse films, where the defense is, but it's just giant monsters fighting, and the riposte is, yes, so why is there so much awfully written human shit? There's genuinely a lot of traction still in giving us uncomplicated superhero fare. And I say this as someone who really wants more morally, philosophically, and intellectually engaging content. A constant theme throughout this review, alongside all the criticism, is that The Flash is a surprisingly heartfelt genre piece. It's nonsensical for the reasons already given, and about a billion more left in reserve, but it's probably the most fun and engaging depiction of both Batman and The Flash in the entire DCU, because so far it's been unburdened of pretensions, or delusions of grandeur. It's unartful, though, because blunt contrast, like jumping from 11 to 8 on the pace scale, takes away much of the mystique of script writing and movie making. When all the action sequences are dialed up to 11, and they constitute the vast majority of the film, and then the short dialogue sections are very quickly dialed down to a 5, it reveals the film's act structure in ways that aren't always flattering, and we will come on to that a bit more later on. But it also tends to mean the action sequences lack subtlety, and have much more reliance on luck than is ideal. We've had one example already with Batman and the Stinger, and we get another one now, when, having grappled on and been dragged behind the escaping van during a chase that's seen quite a lot of inconsequential destruction, The presumed deaths of policemen being commonly deemed by Hollywood as inconsequential, Batman finally catches up with the fleeing villains and ends up knocking the guy with the death suitcase off a bridge, only to grapple onto him to stop him falling into the sea. Which is very fucking lucky, not only that he was in the right position to do it, but also because, as Alfred then informs us after the fact, were the death suitcase to fall into the sea, half of Gotham would be dead before lunchtime. Batman hanging over a bridge dangling a guy with a death briefcase probably constitutes peril, and duly the DCU's war crimes anthem plays. Wonder Woman is here! Yay! She uses the lasso of truth and also of lightning traversal and whatever the fuck else, and she hoists him back up to safety. But, Natch, because she's also lassoed Batman, he also falls under the influence of the lasso of truth. So he starts deconstructing his own character. He says he created his macho alter ego to compensate for his childhood trauma, which, not sure about that one, but carry on. Then he says that if he was really interested in ending crime, he'd have just ended poverty because he's rich enough to do that. And, yeah, no. I'm going to criticize this vociferously because, paradoxically, it's quite rare in this film. The Flash otherwise doesn't go in for this sort of political sloganeering. It is not a strong message film. But that makes it more insidious because it doesn't think it's preaching at you. Instead, it's presenting a political narrative as what it assumes is a common assumption. Bruce, of all people, understands both crime and poverty. His family is famous for its efforts to alleviate poverty. But alleviating poverty does not end crime, in Gotham or in the real world. This is a boilerplate fashionable leftist misinterpretation of the school that says Elon Musk could spend a few billion to end worldwide hunger whilst ignoring the trillions we've already spent trying to end worldwide hunger and the trillions the US spends on social security and associated measures that doesn't end poverty or crime in one single nation. Batman's principal villains aren't motivated by poverty, they are ideological villains. They believe things. They're not uncommonly motivated by injustice, but they transcend specific social conditions, in the way that left-wing ideological criminals tend to be very well off, while right-wing ideological criminals are often working class. Christopher Hitchens noted decades ago that the left that complains about the rich is most often found embroiled in financial crimes, while the family values right is most likely to have its leaders found accidentally choked to death by power cords by the twink they paid to asphyxiate them. The Joker is not explained by poverty. Bane isn't explained by poverty. Ra's al Ghul isn't explained by poverty. Two-Face absolutely isn't explained by poverty. The Penguin isn't explained by poverty, though many of them exploit poverty in various differently populist and demagogic ways to garner support for their causes are not motivated by material deprivation. What's the film trying to portray here as Batman's and so Bruce's truth? That his parents would be alive? That Robin would be alive if he and his family had given more of their wealth away? I mean, it just doesn't work. The lasso of truth compels people to reveal truth.
Now, who are you? We're a small group of reactionary terrorists.
So to have Bruce say all this, he must acknowledge it as the truth. I mean, never mind how that completely defangs his most interesting villains. Are you really telling me that Bruce Wayne has known this since at least his parents died, and he's subsequently done nothing to address it? That theoretically means that he knows that Robin's death, which the DCU skipped over but whatever, is his fault, but on a structural rather than a visceral level. That means he knows he could have stopped the crime he's just been shown fighting had only he been more charitable. Criminals seeking a megadeath virus? Well, if only we'd properly funded Social Security, they'd all be saints. It means he knows that crime in Gotham generally, with all its terrible connotations, is essentially his fault. He didn't give away his wealth though because, well, why? What are you angling for here, film? Could it be you haven't really thought this through? Could it be you're having rich man Bruce tell a joke you're guiltily rich and fashionable friends will laugh at because the comedy assuages their guilt? Could it be you've gone for a trope that unintentionally ridicules the central premise for your hero, and the battles he's fought, and the villains he faces? Nah, that can't be it. I'm sure the film is right. When the Joker explains his traumatic upbringing, we know it's his false consciousness talking. If only Wayne Enterprises had just funded a few more inner-city youth centers, we'd never have had to look at Jared Leto's stupid fucking face. Stop it, Jared. He's not the only one who gets this treatment. The Flash also touches the lasso of truth, and so reveals that he is a virgin. Lol. That's cheap, but by comparison with the Bruce stuff, I guess it's relatively inoffensive. You can see that as a logical extension of the Flash as he's been presented to us. Wonder Woman having saved everyone, we jump slightly forward in time to find that Barry Allen, despite being a recognized member of an established Justice League, still has to work the day job in the forensics lab, which is, well, slightly incongruous. The Justice League is established, all its key members are widely known, we've been painstakingly shown their dealings with government agencies. Though this has been haphazard in the past, Dawn of Madness wanted us to believe the arrival of Superman and his battle with Zod and his world-terraforming spaceship didn't trigger any sort of congressional hearing, but Superman's very poorly alleged involvement in the destruction of a tiny African village launched a full-scale investigation. Okay, whatever, Zach. But with BVS going to such lengths to show us how interested the government is in these metahumans, why isn't the Justice League a more formal entity now? I keep having to do these MCU comparisons. The Avengers are tied to the government, albeit in ways that make for interesting moral dilemmas about the values of freedom and agency versus democratic accountability, which gets a mention at the close of the first Avengers film, comes off more strongly as a consequence of Age of Ultron, and forms the premise of Civil War. Tony Stark is the rich, tech-whiz billionaire analog of Bruce Wayne, with a similar role as uniter and head of the superhero organization. Yet while the older MCU made these characters and organizations fit within the world it had built, in The Flash, no such institutions have really formed. And by institutions I mean formal and informal institutions. Bruce Wayne has a use for Barry Allen, he knows his place, his status, his powers, he's created his suit, he brings him along for formal missions, he's rich enough to have him on staff, even if the government has conveniently forgotten the existence of the Justice League. The Justice League itself doesn't seem to have much by way of an internal structure, it's just summoned into scenes where the writers have decided it might be cool to have them team up, only for them to split up again straight afterwards and disappear from the plot altogether. To be clear, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with having each of our heroes keeping up alter egos, it's the kind of thing that makes sense or not depending on how you build up the world post-Justice League. But DC hasn't built up the world post-Justice League, we're just left with a whole bunch of mechanical questions that, unanswered, leave chunks of the opening act of this film feel vague and hollow and largely inconsequential. We learn that in his forensics role, Barry Allen has been pushing for higher investigative standards, tying in with his ongoing campaign to get his father exonerated for the murder of his mother. We see him arguing with work colleagues who want to get quicker results versus his desire to get the right results, and in isolation, this isn't terrible. The film has tied it into his desire for his father's exoneration, and he hopes that will be accomplished via restored footage from a surveillance camera, proving his dad was out at the supermarket at the time of his mother's murder. And we will break all of this down a bit later. But none of that really requires Barry's presence in a forensic-related day job, does it? Arguably, his job could just as well work against his goals as for them. When we get to that point, we find that it's surveillance footage restored by Wayne Enterprises that represents Barry's best hopes to exonerate his father, which doesn't require that he be working a day job in forensics, and if it were the case that mysteriously restored footage was given to the employee of a forensics company who was related to the condemned man who is up for parole, wouldn't that just increase the odds that the evidence be deemed suspect because the person handing it over has such a pivotal role and a clear conflict of interest? Wouldn't the authorities want to establish a proper chain of evidence? Wouldn't that entail investigating Wayne Enterprises' role in its restoration? Couldn't Wayne Enterprise representatives then be summoned to testify or to turn over information to the courts? Wouldn't that in turn risk exposing Bruce and his relationship with the Flash, for example? Given the Flash will later be shown ignoring some very consequential advice from Bruce, a more compelling alternative might have been for Barry to have got hold of the footage, to have asked Bruce to restore or to manipulate it, and for Bruce to have refused to do that for the above reasons. That would simultaneously flesh out the world as a whole, the tension between private and public personas, and Bruce and Barry's relationship in particular, adding a motive born of resentment that would be paid off in Barry disregarding Bruce's advice about messing with time travel, to which we will shortly come. Following the argument between Barry and his co-workers, we're reintroduced to Slow-Mo Sausage Girl from the Bible Cut. The film has decided that she is or might be, or could be if it had more time, Flash's love interest. Though again, it won't do anything with that. Her role here is so brief and inconsequential, you would be forgiven for wondering why they even bothered. She's a journalist now, and the film tries to manufacture some tension between his simping after her and the job she does. He fancies her, he wants to be open with her, but she's a journalist prying into his private and family life, and that compels caution. She's covering his father's parole hearing, and this is enough at the moment to persuade him to treat her as a journalist, though he will later forget to do this. She says she understands that he'd want to view his father as innocent, and he responds with a comment that isn't meant to be meta, but really could be.
It's not about what I believe, it's about what the truth is.
Yeah, and sex is binary. Moving swiftly on. By the way, Slow-Mo Sausage Girl is what confirms the Snyder Cut as canon for the purposes of this film, because she references their meeting at the beginning of that film, and that meeting did not take place in the Justice Cut. So, yeah, we're operating from the Snyder Cut here, and that's going to pose some problems a bit later, because the film's invoked it for no really established reason, and it will go on to kind of forget everything that happened in that film. Later in the evening, Flash takes a phone call from his father. This is where we learn that he's had Bruce restore the security camera footage in a bid to prove an alibi, but regrettably, it turns out that his dad is wearing a baseball cap and never raises his head to the camera in the supermarket, so we never get to see his face, meaning the new evidence cannot exonerate him after all. Remember this, because it will become very fucking relevant right at the end of the film. Admitting for a moment that the film will go on to break all of this, the exchange between Flash and his dad is good. The family attachment stuff generally is strong throughout this film. It's its only real reason for being, as will be substantiated later. The film is not, really, a story at all. Its close picks up again roughly where this scene ends, moreover without Barry actually learning any real lessons from the intervening 90 minutes. We don't make any kind of progress, we just get a couple of hours of DC's equivalent of a what-if story. The absence of actual story is, I would and will argue, a problem, but it does have its strengths, those being principally an exclusive focus on character at the expense of plot. This film serves as Flash's origin story, but it delivers the origin story in an innovative way. It holds up the pretense of being a story in the present while really being a story about the past. We don't gain distance at the end, but we nominally gain depth, right up until the moment the film sacrifices all of that. It is debatable how much depth we really get, but that is clearly the aspiration. I think it's quite a conscious decision by the writers, and Barry Allen does emerge with a semblance of character depth, if not character progression by the end. I'll happily applaud the creative approach to the origin story, and given how much of the universe is likely to be discarded anyway, the absence of actual progression is way less damaging than it otherwise might have been. But it does still raise the question, what's the point? How much of this is actually going to matter in the end? Will any of it matter? Do you really want to spend more than 2 hours watching a static story filling out a character you might well never see again, and who doesn't really change all that much from beginning to end? Well, time will tell, and time will say nothing but I told you so. Anyway, the family stuff, if taken in isolation, is, by some distance, the strongest element of the film, which is at its best when it focuses on the micro as opposed to the macro. Flash's dad calls him, Flash gives the devastating news that this new evidence they've been banking on simply won't work, and his dad tells him to stop worrying about him and to go on and live his own life. He says it might even be easier for him to stay inside, where he's not constantly reminded of his wife's death. And it does take some charity to buy into all this, given the reason he's inside is his wife's death. But I guess you can work your way to accepting his position. As the conversation plays out, Flash flashes to the old family home for a flashback, and no, there is no way of avoiding that pun, we're just going to have to make do with it. On the phone, his dad asks if Barry remembers the sauce his mum used to make on Sundays, the one with all the tomatoes, and these tomatoes will go on to play a major role in the film. Because you see, and as the flashback depicts in the course of its sepia-tinted depiction of happy childhood days with the doting singing mother, tomatoes are very important to her special sauce. But distressingly, it turns out she only has 1 can of them, and she forgot to pick up a second when she went shopping earlier. We learn this shortly after a scene depicting baby Barry doing maths homework and struggling with a dumb question. The question is, how many combinations can you think of with the answer 24? This frustrates him because there are a bajillion combinations, and she tells him, yeah, he's right, there are a bajillion, but not every problem has a solution, and sometimes you have to let go. This is called foreshadowing. Though it's quite clunkily deployed, given that baby Barry's issue is not a lack of solutions, but too many solutions to list, with the simple solution being to list a whole bunch of them, because there is no way your teacher expects you to list every single example known to maths, and this slightly hazy relationship with grammar and syntax will go on to afflict the film in other ways later. His mother goes to make the pasta and the special sauce, but they only have 1 can of tomatoes, and for some reason they really need more because I guess she really fucking loves her tomatoes. So his dad goes off to the shops to replenish the stock. It's while he's out and baby Barry is upstairs doing more homework that someone breaks in and stabs his mum. His dad gets home just as he goes downstairs and finds his dad leaning over his mother with the knife sticking out of her. His dad tells him to call 911, which for the purposes of a scene transition results in baby Barry running out of the house for some reason, and past present tense Barry, ending the flashback. This is a bit of an odd decision. The motive is slightly unclear. Why run out of your house when your mum is dying and your dad is telling you to call an ambulance? I mean, does he think that his dad murdered her? That's sort of how the film is shot here. You could easily make the assumption, based on the way the scene is constructed, with his father kneeling over his stabbed mother with his hand on the knife. Yet the rest of the film makes it very clear that baby Barry doesn't think that his father is guilty of murder. Quite the opposite. It's not going to suggest that he once thought, perhaps in the moment, that his father was responsible, but then changed his mind at a later date. But then, if he doesn't think his dad's responsible, why is he running away? And even if his mum was almost certainly going to die whatever he did, running out of the house rather than calling an ambulance only makes her odds of survival considerably worse, meaning baby Barry has been shown contributing in some small way to her death. But the film doesn't make that type of guilt a factor in his motives later, so again, why? I suspect the answer is simply that they thought it was a clever way to end the flashback. Back in the present, the call gets cut off and an upset Barry goes for a run. He runs so fast that time starts doing strange things, and in this film, that comes as a surprise to him, though we already know that he knows that if he runs fast enough, this sort of thing will happen.
I don't like to break this rule, but when I approach the speed of light, look, crazy things happen to time, but if I do it, I create massive electrical power.
Is this an issue? I think it might be an issue. The film will, I think, go on to imply that the Flash gets faster with practice and over time, though it's going to do this in the context of an alternate timeline Flash who only just gets his powers without giving any indication how long it takes before he becomes so fast that he can break the speed of light. We could, from that, hypothesize that it takes many, many years before he's able to do this, or just great emotional distress to empower him, hence him only just doing it now for the first time, and we could do all of this were this in fact the first time he had done it, which it isn't, because you'll recall, in the definitive Bible cut that this film is taking as canon, he runs faster than the speed of light twice to save the day.
Just gotta go faster than the speed of light, far beyond the speed of light. You gotta break the rule, Barry, and you gotta do it now.
Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the history and mechanics of the Flash in the comics, because I'm not. Neither apparently are the people who make these films. Film universes and comics universes are different anyway. You can't have recourse to a rule established in a comic book to explain a character ability deployed in a film that is not substantiated in the film. Which leaves me to wonder, why, when he ran faster than the speed of light in the Bible cut, did he not find himself in this mindfuck of time? You'll recall that in that film he didn't just run faster, he ran much, much faster than that. He tells us as much, meaning it's kind of hard to make the case that he's accessed this realm by going much, much faster than the speed of light, as opposed to the earlier film where he only runs much, much faster than the speed of light. Fair enough, says you, it's a different film, it's a different director, nobody who's sensible gives a shit what Zack Snyder says, and ordinarily, I would agree, but the problem is that without clearly establishing that he has just now in this very moment gained a totally new power set that he has never had before, well, the whole premise of this film is called into question. Because this little multiversal time traversal headfuck bubble he's just gained access to allows him to go back in time, and this is presented as new information. That is tenable only if you de-canonize the Bible cut and opt for the theatrical release of Justice League, but it's not tenable if you consider the Bible cut the definitive one, which, to be fair, it probably should be. Flash is already shown traveling through time in the nonsensically written nightmare sequence from Batman v Superman. But if you do canonize the Bible cut, this scene A cannot exist and B cannot be new if it did exist, because Flash is only repeating the use of a power he's already used at least once before. But if he is repeating the use of a power he's already used at least once before, it cannot come as new information to him. And if it's not new information to him, why has he not already used it for the purposes to which it shall shortly be put? Going back in time and attempting to change history. And remember, Slow-Mo Sausage Girl confirms that the Snyder Cut is canon. Then again, the film will go on to explain that the rules of time travel in this context are that going back and changing events in the past creates branching timelines with retro-causality, ripple effects going both forward and backward, creating a brand new future, but also an entirely new past. which means that technically if the Bible cut is canon, then we're already in an alternate universe, because the Flash went back in time twice in that film and changed the course of history. But, well, James Gunn's gonna retcon all of it, isn't he, anyway, so it doesn't really matter anymore. Sometime later, Flash meets up with Bruce and they're chatting about his discovery that isn't a discovery. I believe the Flash here explicitly references his time travel in the Bible cut, further confirming its status as canon, which is awkward because it means both these characters already know he's able to do it, and this profoundly multiverse-altering ability hasn't been broached or experimented with at all since the close of that film. Everyone just kind of forgot about it. Bruce tells him it would be very irresponsible to go meddling with time because of the risk of a butterfly effect destroying absolutely everything. Barry, though, counters that he could fix things. He could save his parents, he could save Bruce's parents, but Bruce replies that scars make us who we are, and we are not meant to go back and fix the past because there is nothing broken about us that needs to be fixed. As a moral message, this is serviceable stuff, and will probably be on safer ground if we stick firmly to what that message represents for Flash's story going forward. We'd be on safer ground because the film will presently distract itself with bullshit multiversal time travel stuff, which, as is almost always the case, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever because it's only a crutch for lazy sci-fi writers, but more on that in due course. Serviceable though the moral message is, Bruce's actions here are not. He's the one who just told us that Flash going back and changing the past is incredibly dangerous. Flash has told him directly that he thinks he can do it, that he has a passionate want to do it, and that his passionate want trumps the dangers in his mind. The upshot of which, from Bruce's perspective, is that Flash is now an unstable threat of gargantuan proportions, and he is highly likely to do something incredibly stupid and destructive. So, naturally, Bruce gets in his car and goes home. You what, mate? I mean, imagine, if you will, the following conversation. Barry, I've just got my hands on a giganuclear bomb. Bruce, well, that sounds like it's incredibly dangerous. Barry, yeah, but I kind of want to explode it. Bruce, exploding it would kill everyone. You shouldn't do it. Barry, yeah, but I really, really want to. I think I'll do it. Bruce, fair enough. See you later. Now imagine that it's that, but bigger and worse, and you basically have their exchange in this scene. Remember how in Spider-Man No Way Home, Doctor Strange wants to send all the villains back to their own universes, but Peter Parker steals the magic box thing and runs away with it because he wants to cure them first in order that they have a chance to live? Strange considers this a significant threat to the multiverse, and so he chases Peter and tries to imprison him in the mirror dimension to stop a potential multiversal disaster. That is a proper response to an idealistic kid who thinks he can save the past and the future be damned. Walking away because you're bored of the conversation? That is not. No, that's like the worst possible thing you could be doing. What the fuck are you doing, Bruce? Slow-mo sausage girl turns up as Bruce drives away because it's time for the plot to move on. Happily, she didn't see Bruce, otherwise the journalist in her might have become highly interested to learn what he's doing hanging around in back alleys with Barry, which risk you'd think might have influenced Bruce not to hang around in back alleys with Barry, but whatever. She says she's not here as a reporter this time, she just wants to talk. So Barry takes her up to his room.
Oh, I know sex exists, I've just never experienced it.
She says she feels bad for being insensitive at their earlier meeting. They have a quick chat about his parents and his desire to fix the justice system, which of course triggers his thoughts about fixing the past again, which in turn causes him to remember the can of tomatoes, which in turn gives him a solution. He dismisses the idea of stopping the bad guy before he kills his mother because, and I quote, that's too much interaction, but he concludes that simply putting a can of tomatoes in his mum's shopping basket would not be too much interaction, so that's what he's going to go and do. Now, this is incredibly fucking dumb, and given we're talking time travel and multiverses, there is an infinite supply of reasons it's incredibly fucking dumb. Why, for instance, is stopping a bad guy killing his mum too much interaction, while saving her via tomatoes, which has the same long-term results, and presumably means that his father is present when the criminal breaks in, which could potentially lead to a fight, which could potentially lead to them both dying anyway, not too much interaction? Why is saving her via tomatoes a more optimal solution than, say, an anonymous tip-off to the police, or, for example, hiding in a bush and throwing a pebble to distract his parents? Or, perhaps, hiding his dad's baseball cap to ensure the CCTV footage exonerates him? And yeah, we are still gonna get to that. Or, perhaps, using super speed to pick up the tomatoes, put them in the cupboard, and leaving again without anyone seeing you, or any number of infinite alternate plans which would achieve the same result. The outcome of each of these plans is the same. His mum lives, his dad never goes to prison, he grows up in a happy nuclear family, which is, by definition, highly interactive and quite obviously future-breaking in ways he should be able to predict. But, obviously, he doesn't. He's supposed to be highly intelligent. Erratic, sure, but intelligent. I'm not arguing that all characters should always be completely sane and rational, far from it. But the plot of this film requires him to be unbelievably insane and stupidly irrational, thereby straining credulity to breaking point. You don't even need to watch the film or think about it for more than 5 seconds to see why and how this will all go so terribly wrong. And you are not supposed to be as smart as Barry Allen. But then without it, there'd be no film, so I guess we'll just have to make do. Off he goes then, leaving Slow-Mo Sausage Girl, a known journalist, in his apartment next to his unlocked PC with the Wayne Enterprise security footage and God knows what other sensitive information just lying around for her to peruse at her leisure. Now you might think that would become relevant at the end, but it won't. So he does the time warp again, which is visually creative, but apparently rendered for a PlayStation 3. I mean, Jesus, they did Henry Cavill dirty here. Just look at this shit. I know we all took the piss out of Justice League Superman's lip, but yeah, this is just awful. No. The director has tried to explain this away in the context of the baby in the microwave thing by saying that we're seeing all of this from the Flash's point of view, and he's going so fast that I guess that he doesn't have the RAM to render graphics properly, but that only works for scenes where we are seeing things from the Flash's point of view. It doesn't work when it all looks equivalently shit, and we're not seeing it from his point of view, as is the case here and several times later. Visually creative though the idea might be, it's also absurd. How the hell is he navigating not only time but space without changing direction? And could it be that they just wanted an excuse to represent time travel with a series of recognizable images? Can you be both lazy and creative at the same time? I guess you can. Flash goes back in time to the supermarket on that fateful day and duly places the tomatoes in his mum's shopping trolley, then he goes running back to the present. There is a very emotional scene involving his mother later, but this is not it. To the film's credit, the stakes and the desires are sufficiently established that we understand the emotional weight of this scene. But if anything, his first encounter with his mother since the day of her death is underplayed here. He pops in, he looks at her briefly, he says, "Don't forget the tomatoes," and he runs off again saying, "Please work," to himself as he goes. And I don't think that constitutes exploiting the scene to its fullest potential. He's in control of time. He could take much more time to actually show a range of emotions here. A longer, more lingering look, a much stronger outpouring, that potent mix of grief and memory and fear and hope could make for a really, really good scene. Something like it does happen later, but this one by contrast feels a bit perfunctory and soulless given what it represents. The return journey does feature various shots of his altered history, featuring his parents alive and together, or at any rate their PS3 avatars doing all of those things, but we're then interrupted by some eldritch creature that invades Flash's time warp bubble and twats him back into space-time. I wonder who this could possibly turn out to be. Inconveniently, he twats Flash into the wrong time period. We don't know it immediately, I guess, but Flash also knows that he doesn't know yet precisely where or when he is. Now, you will remember how acutely aware he was a few seconds ago that he not interact with the past in ways that could fuck up the future, with the exception of that one big thing he's already done that could only possibly fuck up the future. So, not knowing where or when he is, he has a few options open to him here. He could A, have a quick look around to make sure. He could B, try going straight back into the time warp, where the surrounding visuals will try to tell him exactly where and when he is. Or he could C, steal some clothes from some pensioners and wander into his house to say hello to his mother. I really, really hate how writers who think they're onto a good thing think they can also get away with anything else to achieve it. Yes, the film's family motif is genuinely really quite good, but no, you should not have to forgive a cascade of stupid writing to get to that point. He says hi to his mum and dad and they hug and it's nice and they sit down for a family meal and Barry acts like an idiot because that's Ezra's thing. It's also the first time in the film that you really notice Ezra's voice.
School is good. School's been great. I've just been working really hard there on my studies.
Specifically, how weird Twat's voice is. It's hypertense, it's unpleasant to listen to. It's like Twat's vocal cords are in permanent spasm, and Twat has to strain to get any sound out. It gets significantly worse later, but it's generally a problem whenever Twat has an extended dialogue scene, which is unfortunate since Twat has several of them. Blissfully and terribly and predictably, he is interrupted when he sees another version of himself walking up the garden path, and you would think that he would think, fuck, this could be irrevocably broken. I cannot coexist with another version of me. I can't avoid him, I can't stop him coming into the house, I can't kill him for obvious grandfather paradox reasons. The least worst option I have is to do the time warp instantly and hop back to the proper time and place. Just hope the past version of me and my family concoct some explanation for themselves. It was a prank, it was an imposter, it was a collective hallucination, anything at all that's better than them realizing that I've time traveled back and completely transformed their lives. But nah, because, we have a film that needs to happen. So what does the Flash do? Well, he runs outside and he rugby tackles the alternate version of himself, then he pins him up against a wall and asks him what year it is. Jesus fucking Christ. Then, when learning that this other version of himself is just 18, Ezra kidnaps him and goes on a drug-fueled klepto tour across the state of Nevada. Only joking, no, he goes back into the time warp and goes back to the present day as quickly as possible. Only joking, no, that would be sensible. Instead, he takes him up to their room and tells him everything, and it has just occurred to me that this is an actual, genuine, legitimate occasion where referring to Ezra Miller by they-them pronouns actually makes grammatical sense. Barry Prime actually tells Alt Barry that their meeting is catastrophic, that he's not supposed to be here, that they're not supposed to have met, that they really shouldn't be talking. Which, that's all true, but it's like the film has completely forgotten he's able to do the time warp thing at will. He knows all of this, so why is he doing it? Well, at least it's the film's excuse to deploy what I think is another meta joke. Barry Prime finds old younger Barry incredibly irritating. He doesn't stop talking. He's not charming, it's abrasive, it's irritating, and oh my god, I'm starting to realize what people mean. Yes, self-reflection. Good job, film. Better than nothing. Know what could have happened instead? You could have not written him this way, but we are where we are, though we shouldn't be. You can interpret that line any way you like, it's all absolutely true. Barry Prime threatens to drug the kid, which is also meta, allegedly, and begins to grapple with what he's done. Has meeting himself essentially fucked up all of space-time? Well, yes, and unavoidably. That's why he shouldn't still be here, though it's also why he should never have come to begin with, because he uniquely knows the conditions that led to him getting his powers, and so uniquely was in a position to say with some certainty that he would not have got his powers if he had done what he just did, because having done what he just did, he won't do what he did, and won't be what he is. My god, I fucking hate time travel. Having opted against drugging himself, he goes to punch himself at super speed while pondering how hard he'll have to hit himself to make the old version of him forget everything that's happened. Which is an incredibly stupid thing to do, because he'll take his own head clean off. Happily though, old Barry blurts out just in time that he has a date later, and this compels Barry Prime not to holdo maneuver his own head. Only now does Barry Prime consider it might be an idea if he just, left and went home, but as he's walking to the door, he hears rain and thunder, which leads him to realize that this is the day he is supposed to get his powers. Which, of course, is now set not to happen, because he changed the past, and somehow didn't foresee this entirely predictable eventuality. He exposits the potential consequences. We're too intelligent to need all of this, but the film's target audience apparently is not. If he doesn't get his powers, he'll never have his powers. He'll not be able to get back to the present, and then who knows what'll happen. Unlike him, I remember the last film, and the fact that he needs his powers to stop Steppenwolf and Darkseid having their way with reality, so at least one of the possible futures is that there is no future. He is guaranteed billions of people die, which is a happy thought. So now, Barry Prime and Alt Barry have to go together to the lab where he's supposed to get the powers. They infiltrate the lab, Barry Prime positioning Alt Barry in the right chair at the right angle beneath the right array of chemicals, ready to get hit by lightning. Old Barry panics when he hears this is the plan and tries to leave, and despite being the Flash and knowing this part of his history and having superhuman reactions, we need the rest of the film to happen, so Barry Prime obligingly stands in the way like a moose, and they both get struck by lightning-infused chemicals. You really don't need me to tell you what happens next, because of course it means that Barry Prime loses his powers, and old Barry gets them, although he's lost his powers and been struck by lightning, and yet that doesn't seem to have affected him too much. We have an obligatory humorous interlude as Barry Prime tries to use his powers to phase through a wall and walks right into it, where he tries to do his weird power skating run thing, and ends up doing it at normal speed where it looks even sillier, and then the terrible realization he is a normal human now. The two Flashes eventually escape and get home, but the realization that he has powers now turns old Barry into a completely insufferable child with a laugh
many times myself. You can't just start.
That is quite possibly more annoying than Jared Leto's Joker. Will you shut the fuck up, Jared? And he goes manic, running through the streets again until his clothes catch fire from the friction, meaning we get naked Ezra Miller whether we liked it or not, and your honor, we did not consent. When old Barry finally returns, Barry Prime tries to explain basic physics to him, like for instance that you can't move people very far at all using super speed, just like we didn't see him doing at all in the last film. Old Barry gets tired and falls asleep during this explanation, so they have to pick things up the next day, when Barry Prime gives old Barry the ring in which the Flash suit is stored, to solve the problem of him indecently exposing himself to strangers. And yeah, before you ask, I'm pretty sure that's on Ezra's charge sheet as well. Life imitates art and all that. There is precisely one good reference in this scene, as old Barry whispers the words from Sauron's One Ring as he slips the ring on. I like that. It's also nice to see Ezra fingering a ring that's not. Barry Prime's plan is to train old Barry to use his powers to recreate the speed-time vortex thing and get Barry Prime back to the future, just like he could and should have done himself when he had the goddamn powers, but didn't because that's not in the script. He uses the words Back to the Future, and because this is a time travel film, well, obviously. This is our first indication, by the way, that we may not simply be in the past, because an argument ensues, and will be reprised on several occasions, about who starred in Back to the Future. Old Flash insists it wasn't Michael J. Fox, who was in Footloose instead, it was Eric Stoltz, he says. Again, you don't need me to tell you where this is going, but the film thinks it's being coy, and to be fair to it, it has established old Barry as an unreliable narrator. The film in this respect isn't predictable for anything it itself is doing, but rather because it's a modern superhero film, and modern superhero films embroil themselves in multiversal nonsense as reliably as old men get hernias, albeit with more painful consequences. But we'll grapple with that bit later. For now, the plot needs to move along, and it achieves this by having a random woman scream, which lets us know that something somewhere is very wrong. They-thems go to the nearest TV store, but a news report informs us that Zod's ship is currently hovering somewhere over Australia, which is fine, I guess. If there's one country in the entire world where the wildlife is more deadly than genocidal Kryptonians, it's Australia. He'll land and get his face eaten by a tarantula, while a kangaroo kicks his dick off, and the world will live on in peace and in safety. Unless you too happen to live in Australia. But they-thems are very concerned, because it transpires Flash 2 has a bit of history with Zod, as we learn in another flashback. Much as with the beginning of BVS, we get a view from the ground of Superman's battle with Zod and the destruction it wrought to mere mortals. Unlike BVS, which was a bit hazy on the world engine's gravity distortion, this film was definitely paying attention, and we see a young and inexperienced Flash turn up in the streets and try to help people. He immediately latches onto a young child. No, look, we've made all the jokes now, alright? We don't need any more Ezra Miller jokes. He saves the child, but cannot save the child's father. Though by the rules the film explained not that long ago, I'm pretty sure running away with the child at super speed would have killed it. Just another day in the life of Ezra. Oh, fucking hell. Only Superman could stop Zod, Barry Prime explains, as he comes out of the flashback. Notably, he does not hold a grudge against Superman for defeating this vast and world-destroying evil, unlike a certain other idiot I could mention. Superman in this world is still unknown, though, leading Barry Prime to conclude that he is still in hiding. So, what does he resolve to do? Well, you'll recall that not so long ago, sitting on the bed in the family home, Barry Prime was very worried that his encountering and talking to old Barry could be catastrophic for the world.
This is mad trippy.
Dude, this is catastrophic.
You'll likewise recall that just a few minutes ago, his plan was to teach Alt Barry to do the time warp in order to send him home, in the hopes he would minimize the damage his presence is doing to this timeline. You'll recall also that he was very aware that he would be doing damage to the timeline, so interacting with it in as small a way as possible was his motive to going into it, and so on and so on. All of these scenes clearly demonstrate that he is keenly aware of the threat his presence poses to the past. But if the film is consistent in one way above all others, it's that it always has Barry Prime act in the precise opposite way that he should, given his knowledge. So rather than assuming that Superman will turn up and beat Zod, which, as he knows, is supposed to happen in the future, which is destructive but ultimately successful, he decides he has to go and find all of the Justice League members so they can team up against Zod and stop the destruction from happening to begin with. You fucking what, Barry? Remember, the film at this point still wants us under the impression that this is simply the past in a single linear timeline. Besides the immediate disruption he's caused, currently limited as far as he knows to his parents and his past self, Barry has no reason to suspect that events entirely unrelated to his past self will have been altered. Or rather, he should have grasped the impact of his actions, but hasn't. Given that he's now keenly aware and has experienced the problems that will stem from interacting with the past, and given he's told us several times how he fears this, and given he said several times that he needs to go home, even though he didn't when he could have done, and when he should have done, why is he now flipping on a dime and setting off in pursuit of a goal that is as drastically opposed to his preceding one as you could possibly imagine? Why is he selectively aware of the issues here, and selectively an idiot who forgets them whenever the film needs him to? You could perhaps expand his motive on the part of the writers who didn't into a desire to fix everything rather than just his backstory? That might be tenable if you hadn't already made it abundantly clear that he is terrified of the risks of doing just that, and aware of his need to go home, and if you hadn't made his mother the sole focus in his mind's eye with respect to the faults of history. But because the film did do all of those things, this is a catastrophically dumb decision. The other way you could have fixed this is if you'd had Barry Prime figure out that he is not simply further back in the linear progression of time, but rather on a branching timeline with retrocausality, in a different universe effectively, one in which Superman does not exist. You could have him observe Zod's arrival and waiting, hopefully, for Superman to emerge as he believes he will, only to come to the sudden and terrible realization that he isn't going to. For comparison, there's the scene in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, where Harry, having used the time turner with Hermione, believes that his father is going to appear to save his past self from the Dementors. He waits, and his father just doesn't appear, and it's at that point he realizes that it was never his father, it was he himself who cast the Stag Patronus to save his past self. Which I think makes a bit more sense than the time travel in this film, as it more closely accords with the idea in physics and philosophy that single timeline time travel works because you always did what you went back in time to do, limiting, if not doing away entirely, with the potential for paradoxes. There's a whole thing about closed timeline loops and self-consistency principles. Anyway, that's an example of a not dissimilar setup with a much more logical payoff than this film. If you had Barry realize, either before now or in the moment of Superman's non-appearance, that this is not his history, not his timeline, not his universe, and that his presence here is ensured that this is the case, then, coupled with the loss of his powers making it impossible for him to return home, you could, with a bit of charity, reason your way to his present course of action. But that is not what the film does, because this film is really, really quite silly. So instead, we get him acting against instinct, knowledge, and awareness, yet again, for the sake of a plot that has no legs. Good stuff. Yet more evidence that this is not a linear timeline follows when he learns that the work friends from his world are Alt Barry's roommates, a realization that ought to have meant more to him than it is shown doing. He uses Alt Barry's laptop to search for various members of the Justice League. After a quick Google search, he finds the phone number for Boba Fett, who is meant to be Aquaman's dad, but in this universe, he isn't. His wife isn't the Queen of Atlantis, and he has no son. In this universe, Arthur Curry is his dog. So you're telling me he didn't grow up surrounded by water? This scene is quite well shot, by the way. The comedic timing is on point. I did chuckle at this one.
Okay, and your wife is the Queen of Atlantis?
No.
And this finally twigs something in Barry's mind. He begins to realize that he might just have destroyed history entirely, as he was warned would happen, and as he was worried would happen, and as he knew would happen, except for most of the plot, when he forgets that it happens. This realization isn't quite enough though, and so the film proceeds to run the Back to the Future references into the ground. Barry frets he's created a world with no metahumans, which is a bit of a reach. The same mechanics that made him a metahuman in this timeline also made old Barry into old Flash, meaning there's little reason to suspect that no metahumans exist just because you haven't been able to find Aquaman. A better concern would be that in this timeline, any number of metahumans could exist, but they aren't the ones he knows exist, meaning he cannot find them, meaning he will not be able to stop Zod. That's a simple little dialogue tweak, but it'd also do a little bit to strengthen the film's underlying logic, which seems not really to exist at the moment. However, as Barry Prime reels off the list of names he believes no longer exists, mention of Batman catches the attention of his low-life roommates. They do know of Batman. Batman does exist, but they don't know what his real name is. Again, the film isn't entirely sure of its own rules, because it just got finished telling us that this could be a world with no metahumans, and yet Barry's first inclination is to rely on his future knowledge of a different timeline, and reason they need to go and see Bruce Wayne. Even though at this point, he has no real reason to assume that any Batman who exists in this world would be Bruce Wayne as opposed to any other guy. Again, a fairly simple fix, show him worrying much more overtly that this might be the case, but figuring he has no alternative, and any chance is better than the certain chance of world destruction. But once again, can't really be bothered having Barry actually comprehend the rules he himself is figuring out, so yeah, we're off to Wayne Manor. Which in this world is just kind of there, unguarded and unlocked and left open for anyone to stroll in. So they duly stroll right in. Which would be fine if we went on to learn the place was abandoned and Bruce wasn't there anymore, though it still wouldn't explain why this huge mansion with lots of priceless artifacts remained unspoiled by thieves and vagabonds and such. But which doesn't work quite so well if, as we already know because we've seen the trailers, Bruce is still in residence and does actually care about homebreakers. They go for a waltz through the mansion, evidence of habitation abouts, fire, music playing, pot boiling on the stove, but there is no Bruce. That is, until some hobo-looking hairy guy leaps out of the pantry and attacks them. Old Barry is fine, of course, because he has powers and can dodge all the attacks. Barry Prime gets twatted several times because he doesn't have the powers and cannot dodge all the attacks. And once again, old Barry is just so fucking annoying. I really, really wanted him to get punched, and it was very disappointing that he didn't. Eventually, they subdue Bruce, and he turns around to reveal that he is Michael Keaton, which surprises Barry, but not us, because we saw the publicity material and the studio wanted to give us any reason besides Ezra Miller to turn up and see the film. At some point during the scene transition, Barry explains the time travel conundrum to old Bruce. And in this universe, old Bruce is an expert on time travel theory, because the plot needs someone to do an exposition dump and it might as well be him. He explains that time is not linear, which Barry should already know, but whatever, and we get modern media's umpteenth multiverse explanation, this one involving spaghetti. Old Bruce explains that not only is time not linear, traveling back in time does not merely create branching futures. Instead, it puts you on an entirely different piece of spaghetti with an entirely different past and an entirely different future. Barry Prime calls this an ontological paradox model of time travel, which does make you wonder why, if he's already aware of this model, he wasn't aware of it until right now when he is already aware of it. Now that is an ontological paradox. I'm not entirely convinced the film really knows what it means when it says this though, because, and look, I'm not an expert in these matters because, I like to go outside and meet people, but there is no ontological paradox model of time travel that I'm aware of. An ontological paradox is a result of certain theories of time travel, and generally speaking, a paradox is an apparent contradiction that needs to be solved in order that the hypothetical scenario or theory fits with, for example, the theory of general relativity. This film seems about to suggest that an ontological paradox is itself a model of time travel, and I'm pretty sure that isn't a thing, but before I can get any way into explaining or fleshing any of this out, old Bruce shuts Barry up with a spoonful of pasta sauce. And honestly, it's kind of a relief, because time travel sucks, and I'm fucking sick of multiverses. And a multiverse is, of course, what we've got, as old Bruce explains to us, though how he knows so much about all of this is a mystery that will never be solved. He asks about Zod, and Barry Prime explains what Zod is, and who Superman is, and what's meant to happen. And we get another meta joke, old Bruce asking why nobody ever considered that a name like Superman might be a little too on the nose, prompting Barry Prime to point out that old Bruce called himself Batman because, lol, history is cringe and funny and meta jokes are refreshing and new and we must have them all of the time, everywhere, all at once. Old Bruce isn't Batman though, or rather he was, but he is not anymore, because in this universe, Gotham is one of the safest cities on the planet, and it has no real need for the Caped Crusader anymore, so he retired and became the Dude. Once again, I'm not sure this speaks very well of his character. Are you telling me that because the local neighborhood is safe, this talented billionaire crime fighter chose to retire and fall into drink and lethargy rather than helping other, less privileged places attain the same level of security? The film then forgets that it recently had Barry Prime conclude that he'd created a world with no metahumans because the scene progresses to him asking old Bruce for his help. As the best detective in the world, he is best placed to find Superman. But old Bruce, who knows and apparently believes that Zod is here to destroy the world, says, "Pass," and he walks off. Just, fuck's sake. Why? Why, film? Not only is it not explained why a safe Gotham should produce a retired, lazy, fat Batman, it hasn't, won't, and can't explain why the emergence of a threat to the whole world wouldn't spur the retired, lazy, fat Batman back into action. And it hasn't, won't, and probably won't explain why old Bruce being retired and lazy means he is absolutely fine with the Barrys going off to his Batcave to steal his Bat stuff, which is what they do next. The Batcave itself is one huge pot of member berry sorbet, bringing back all the Tim Burton era feels, and it's a curious choice. I'd wager the demographic that was alive for and remembers Michael Keaton as Batman is probably the least likely to forgive Ezra Miller twat's crimes, and it'll be genuinely interesting to see a demographic breakdown of this film's eventual audience. I don't think I was alive when Michael Keaton was Batman, and it's testimony to the power of symbols and iconography that I still got a big old hit of memberberry-induced fondness for this old-timey Batcave, the old-timey computers, the old-timey Batmobile, and all the rest. But it does contribute to what would inevitably have been this film's issue, irrespective of the travails of its lead actor, because none of this is really a story. None of this constitutes progression. This type of cameo fest is designed to capitalize on nostalgic memories and earn dollar off the good work done by better people long ago. There are ways to tie this into present-day storylines. Spider-Man No Way Home did it, and there are ways to not tie it into present-day storylines like Multiverse of Badness. Though, spoiler alert, none of the cameos in this film will go on to get their necks snapped by a witch in a fit of perimenopausal rage. Their contribution to plot and character progression really isn't that far away from Multiverse of Muffins in consequence, though, which is to say they will prove pretty damn inconsequential by the end. And that, I would submit, is a sign of a genre in terminal decline. We've reached the what-if phase of superhero movies. The reason you can't go more than 5 minutes without someone trying to explain how multiverses work is that multiverses, like time travel, are lazy writers' crutches. They can theoretically move stories along, but more often they're an excuse for money-hungry studios to lapse into cheap action figure fights. What if we brought back this old character to fight this old one? Everyone loved them. They'll definitely pay to see them fight each other, pretext be damned. But just as it would be churlish to deny the little pang of excitement you get when the brilliantly familiar appears on the screen once again, I think studios vastly overestimate the appeal of stuff like this, certainly beyond the short term. Ultimately, the reason these characters, places, and things are popular is that past generations invested in the stories they were a part of. Story comes above everything else. You can bring them back to the screen, but if you aren't going to make them part of an equivalently engaging story, the only appeal they make is to vague memories of happier times. And though that is not nothing, it's not much of anything either. Old Barry decides to be exceptionally annoying at this juncture, even by his exceptionally annoying standards, and he goes manically running around the cave pointing to all the nostalgia bait, while Barry Prime uses the Bat computer to Bat Google all the Clark Kents in America, even though he's just been told how this is an entirely different universe, and there's no reason to believe that any Superman exists, or that if he does exist, he is a Clark Kent, as opposed to some other guy. He then tries to Bat cross-match the Bat Google results with the Bat search of NASA's databanks, looking for unidentified objects to have crashed near Kansas in the last 50 years. And I'm Bat certain that this is a terrible idea because NASA is highly unlikely to have a comprehensive list of such objects from the last 10 years, never mind the last 50. And because, once again, this is a different universe where Superman, if he exists at all, could have crashed in any manner anywhere else at any other time. which would be fine if the film portrayed this as a desperate search by Barry that he's only undertaking in the absence of any other strategy, because he knows how unlikely it is that these events match those of his universe, but the film hasn't done that, and it isn't ever going to do that, because it's not really interested in the laws and rules it's establishing on the fly. To give it some credit though, it has here written Alt Barry's interminable douchiness into a proper character point, because Barry Prime is as annoyed by him as the audience is, and he eventually loses his temper completely when Alt Barry responds to a telling off with, "Sorry mum." Barry Prime's response, though not rational, he's not told Alt Barry about their mother's death, is rationally irrational. It does a good job of showing that his comparative seriousness and maturity is the result of the profound loss that he suffered, which forced him to grow up in a way that Alt Barry hasn't had to. He is more aware of the world, of stakes, of the potential for loss and tragedy because he's experienced it, while Alt Barry is insufferably childlike because he's never had to live a serious life. Barry Prime has come to recognize this difference between them, even if he's imperfectly grasped the cause of it, so his outburst here and the clear and evident bitterness and regret that underpins it is well done. Good character writing. It's well performed as well, though again I have to moan about Ezra Miller's weird, strained, suffering vocal cords.
No idea how lucky you are. No idea. You take everything for granted. You don't even appreciate. You just walk around thinking that you're so funny and so cool. And it's embarrassing because you're not any of those things.
It's leveraged pretty well here because Twat is trying to convey that kind of tense, passionate anger that naturally produces a strange shout. But the fact Twat speaks like this in various other settings where it's less appropriate suggests it's more a habit than it is acting, in which case Twat could really do with a vocal coach of some sort. Also, if we're to look past the genuine emotional impact of the scene, the underlying reason is still a bit faulty. Alt Barry rightly points out that he's done everything he's been asked, but Barry Prime won't even tell him why he's here to begin with. And so we have to ask, yeah, why hasn't he done that yet? It was barely tenable much earlier, when he was still concerned with minimizing interactions that could distort the timeline. But events have moved on since then, and Barry Prime has severally forgotten his concerns about impacting the timeline, and he's now learned that it's not his timeline anyway, so why not tell Alt Barry the reason why? Anyway, we move on. Bruce is watching the Barrys in his Batcave using his Bat laptop and is, as mentioned, peculiarly unconcerned by what they might be doing or stealing. Barry Prime knows Bruce is watching them and makes a depersonalized appeal to Bruce's Bat nature. This is an opportunity for the film to make some plot-convenient tweaks to its already bullshit multiverse setup to ensure that certain familiar things and people always occur, and certain points where the spaghetti intersect a timeline universal constants or something. Bruce's always have Alfred's, for example. Barry Prime says he's read all about temporal paradoxes and causal loops, though if he had, then why the fuck is he here? But he says, this has to be more than that, because no time travel theory anticipates inevitable intersects between multiverses. So maybe he says, it's fate, yada yada yada. It's a cheap and lazy way of getting around the problems with time travel the writers have, I presume, belatedly realized. Appropriately cheap and lazy given time travel and multiverses are themselves so often cheap and lazy to begin with. It allows Barry Prime to tell Alt Bruce that he's sorry about his parents, but he's just trying to save his, and maybe this will be a way. Which is fine, except that he's already done that, and nothing he's presently doing has anything much to do with saving his parents, does it? Or does it? What exactly is the deal here? He knows this isn't his universe or his timeline, so when he leaves, does he expect his mum to be alive in his world? Or is he trying to save her in this timeline in full knowledge it won't impact the one he has to return to? But if that's the case, has he reasoned or established that the death of his parents is a universal timeline constant? It'd seem he'd have to have reached that conclusion, otherwise he should be fairly safe in the knowledge that one of an infinite number of universes and timelines never saw his mother killed or his father imprisoned. Though if he has reached that conclusion, then he should surely have figured out that it's unchangeable, that it's fate as he described it, so why is he trying to preserve the world in a universe that isn't his to save parents who fate has doomed to the condition that prompted his travels through time to begin with? I mean, I'm not even sure this is a criticism. It's quite possible there's some permutation I've missed. But generally, when thick forests of epistemic and ontological questions like this arise in a film that is otherwise badly written, it's because the writers did not intend them and weren't really aware what they were setting up, meaning we are here doing much more work than they did in trying to even account for a list of possible consequences. Barry's appeal works on old Bruce, though it should by rights have then worked on Barry himself and precluded him making the appeal to begin with, and old Bruce dons a batsuit and descends to the Batcave alongside his Batplane. Why do they need a Batplane? Well, because while Barry Prime was having a snooze, old Batman produced a heavily redacted file of Bat paper showing that Clark Kent is being held hostage by a mercenary group in Siberia. And that whiplash pain in your neck is the plot suddenly realizing it's dawdled here too long, and now it needs to move on very, very quickly indeed. But hey, at least it numbed the pain with a hefty dose of memberberry straight to the veins. Is it worth pointing out that Bruce's change of heart makes very little sense? That he's the one who told Barry Prime about their inevitable intersect in multiversal history, but that he's now been swayed by Barry Prime's desire to save the parents we kind of have to assume has assumed he himself has lost oh fuck it. I detest time travel. Fuck this film. Anyway, we're off to Siberia now, and they arrive in quite splendid fashion. The Batplane's ejector seats dangling beneath it, Batman himself leaping off without a parachute, the Barrys follow on parachutes and a very lucky wind. A passing shot of the Batplane silhouetted bat-like against the Bat Moon. It all looks great. Very much enjoyed this bit. Still not quite sure how they knew to get here, but here we are anyway, and we've come in spectacular fashion. It will be noted that despite housing here perhaps the most valuable asset in the history of all valuable assets, the Rusky mercenaries have not seen fit to post any sort of guard or watch outside the heavily armed and fortified compound they are, one assumes, merely squatting in. Meaning our heroes are not spotted in the air, are not spotted parachuting down, aren't spotted grappling up the cliff, aren't spotted walking through the compound, aren't overheard talking while they do all of this, aren't detected coming down the clanky metal ladder, which they alight in a room surrounded by rooms with glass walls behind which various scientist nerds are working. Our heroes make no especially strenuous attempts to hide themselves, but in the event it wouldn't have mattered because Alt Flash knocks over an inconveniently freestanding metal pole, and it creates a large clang which alerts the scientists, who activate an alarm, which brings out a whole army of mercenary grunts who one assumes have just been standing around down here, waiting for their cue from the director because they sure as hell weren't patrolling the perimeter. One of the mercs shoots at Barry Prime, and Alt Flash uses his powers to move him out of the way. And this is where the film sacrifices the mechanical consistency of several films in aid of essentially scat humor. Because you'll recall, because I've taken care to point it out, the several occasions in this film and previous films where Flash has used super speed to move people around, getting them out of harm's way and such. He's been shown doing this even after Barry Prime explained in this film and for the first time that he can't do it because it's not safe to move people at super speed unless they are, for instance, safely secured in microwaves first. The result of Old Flash saving Barry Prime by moving him ever so slightly out of the way of an oncoming bullet is that Barry Prime throws up. A lot. For a while. Which you'll notice has never happened before, even on those occasions where he's been shown moving people much further than Old Flash just moved him. I think it would have improved the Bible cut had Slow-Mo Sausage Girl been shown spewing her guts into the gutter after he saved her from the car crash, but I can't help but note that that is not what happened. Likewise, it didn't happen to the small child we saw him rescuing in the flashback to Zod's attack much earlier in the film. Why is it that the film has only just decided moving people around at super speed might cause them to throw up? Well, because it's funny, apparently. Honestly, they were one step away from just having Barry Prime fart his way through the film. The scene also suffers from the same nonsense that plagued Wonder Woman's introduction to the Bible cut, as she dramatically goes along the line of hostages, deflecting bullets one by one rather than, making moves toward the guy who's actually doing the shooting. Old Flash in this scene doesn't actually need to move Barry Prime out of the way. He could simply move the bullet. Given there's such a large time gap between the first round and the next set of rounds fired by the mercs, he could have moved that bullet, run toward them, moved the rest of the bullets, taken out the guards, done all of this in roughly the same amount of time it took him to carefully reposition Barry Prime. Why didn't he do that? Well, I guess you could make the case that he's just too dumb to think of it, though I'm very tired of relying on this argument to explain dumb character decisions. But the macro reason is, of course, that if he'd done that, we'd not have got the vomit joke. Aren't we all glad we got the vomit joke? I do love me a good vomit joke. Because Old Flash didn't take out the guards and didn't react when they came and surrounded he and puking Barry, it does afford old Batman the chance to show what he can do. For a guy who, just a few minutes ago, was a hairy drunken bum, he still remembers most of the moves. This being one of the more dimly lit scenes, the CGI also looks less awful than it does elsewhere, though really, this is one of those rare films that actually looks better if you watch the weird Indian bootleg copy, because you can't really spot the awful textures that are so apparent on the cinema screen. It's also worth noting that for all the damage it did to his old Bruce character earlier, the film is giving old Batman a chance to do what he is meant to do: beat up bad guys and look cool. It's something Batfleck seldom got to do because both Justice League and the Bible Cut struggled to find a place for a man in a batsuit in a huge fight against otherworldly parademons and superpowered alien invaders. This fight scene all adds to the nostalgia value of his presence, and though I firmly stick by what I said earlier about the limited use value of nostalgia, I reiterate that it does have some value. It's fun seeing old Batman kicking ass like he did before I was alive. The fact he's appealing to an older demo and is cast as an older Batman and is still shown to be able to bash people's heads in adds to the demography-specific appeal of the character. One of the reasons we're seeing older action heroes reprise their roles and action leads in films like Taken and John Wick portrayed as older gentlemen is, I think, reflective of the changing cohort of cinema goers. Older men like to feel they're still able to knock the youngsters about if they really need to, like seeing their skills and their strength haven't necessarily been diminished by age. They have, if anything, been augmented by knowledge and practical wisdom. So you'll get the self-knowing jokes about joint pain, Batman muttering "this might hurt" to himself before he jumps off the ledge to take on the bad guys, but he still takes on and takes out the bad guys with aplomb and panache, and I'm all for it. In a media landscape that so often sees men, and particularly older men, demonized and put down by younger, invariably female protagonists, portrayals like this are refreshing. To the extent this film has engendered any positive feelings in its audience, and the early box office suggests there hasn't been much of an audience either way, I suspect it does have something to do with this particular choice and portrayal of an older Batman still capable of kicking ass and chewing bat gum, and he's all out of bat gum. Having beaten up the first set of mercs, they wander through the base and come upon a big spherical prison. And as I was watching this the first time, I was already beginning to brainstorm ball and scrotum jokes, only for the film to preempt me almost instantly.
That's where you keep Superman. With a big scrotum.
And I can't work out whether to be surprised or disappointed by that. Maybe both. Old Batman begins trying to hack the giant prison bollock, but Old Fash instantly cracks it, informing us that he tried all the combinations, which, no. Again, no. Funny, I guess. But if Flash can spend that much time in superspeed and take up less than a second of our real-world time, there is absolutely no reason he should struggle in any fight scene ever. Ever. The Metal Man bag opens up to reveal not Superman, not even Clark Kent, but a strange and unconscious girl. And we all know what Ezra Miller gets up to with unconscious... I know, it's low-hanging fruit, but in my defense, I'm not actually doing this on purpose. The jokes literally just write themselves. I mean, all I have to do is describe the scene where they come upon this strange, young, drugged-up girl, and my keyboard just immediately on its own comes out with, and naturally, Ezra Miller I wasn't at the time sure, and I remain unsure now, what the provenance of the big testicle is. Is it a prison the mercenaries built? Was it always on the Siberian base? Is it the ship she crash-landed on? What rendered her unconscious and stripped her of her clothes? Was it Ezra Miller? God fucking damn it. But something knocked her out, and stripped her, and put her in prison rags, and kept her semi-conscious at best. I don't recall seeing kryptonite in the testicle, but given she's a Kryptonian, wouldn't there need to be kryptonite around to explain how she was able to be captured and kept subdued? Never mind, not massively important in the scheme of things. We have to run away for another action scene. Old Batman and the Barrys, probably an indie band of some sort, pick her up and run off through the underground tunnels again, where they are accosted by a chef, of all things, who goes to pull a gun on them, only for Old Flash to take him out. Unfortunately, the chef gets a round off and it goes through Old Barry's kneecap, and I do have questions about this, because I understand if the film wants to portray it as though moving objects still obey the laws of mass and velocity, even as Flash accelerates to super speed, but the problem there is that we've previously been shown that not happening, like when he goes to push Wonder Woman's sword back to her in the Bible Cut. He pushes it with his finger on the point of the sword, slowing its momentum so she can catch it. But unless I'm badly misunderstanding my physics, the laws as they apply in this film should have it that the sword goes right through his finger. If he accelerates to super speed but remains subject to real-time mass and momentum, then every time he trips and falls into walls, he should explode. Narratively, of course, it's happened because the film needs to drum up stakes and tension, and it hasn't thought of a way to do that while Old Flash retains his powers. I do understand that point, but it's a huge problem with superhero films generally, and it applies to some characters more than others, and it results from carelessness, lack of thought, and lack of imagination. If, in the first place, you haven't established clear limitations on powers, then you're liable to write yourselves into situations where you need or want X to happen, but X can only happen without those powers. Absent a properly thought out rule set for powers, you'll then reduce to contriving excuses for them not to be used. He forgets he has them, he uses the wrong one, he makes a bafflingly dumb decision that prohibits him from using them, etc. You end up writing around the character you've created rather than for the character you've created. But the thing is, this film established a rule set right at the beginning, the calorie counter device that it forgot existed after the first scene. This escape sequence is exactly the type of situation where that mechanic would be most useful. Have Old Flash run out of energy and be unable to use the powers, putting a newly powerless Barry Prime in the position of rescuing a superhero as Old Batman rescues the unconscious girl. You pay off an earlier setup, you add a bit more depth to Barry Prime's powerless form by showing his bravery and his heroism is independent of his status as a superhero, and you get the dramatic chase sequence with nominal stakes. It's so easy to solve problems like this, especially when the film has given you all the tools you need to do it, which makes it especially baffling that the film doesn't remember it has them. In any case, our heroes are driven back to the giant testicle, and old Batman pushes them down into the pit beneath it. The ball pit, if you will. Chief Russian Merc goes to drop the giant testicle on them, and this is just a lazy attempt to drum up the stakes further, quite apart from it being very unclear what the point of dropping the giant testicle a few feet to the floor would be in any other situation. There's also a convenient, for the writers, 3-step process to doing it. Evil Russian pulls one lever, the ball drops some way, he pulls the second lever, it drops further, he pulls the third one, it drops further again. But if his goal is to squash people with this testicle, why doesn't he throw all 3 levers at once? Why does he do a dramatic pause in between pulling each of them? And given they end up just destroying it with a rocket launcher to knock it down the rest of the way after it gets jammed, why not do that to begin with? The fact he does do dramatic pauses between pulling the levers gives old Batman time to cut a hole through the floor grate and they all drop down before the huge testicle can squash them. They find an unpowered elevator up to the surface, but Old Flash has conveniently forgotten he has healing powers for the moment, so he's still unable to help them. Never fear though. Old Batman puts explosives onto the elevator and launches them back up to freedom, where they are surrounded by all those very many mercenaries who weren't at their stations to begin with, leading to this huge mess. Before they all die, mysterious drugged girl soars up into the air and all the Ruskies start shooting at her, but the bullets won't penetrate. She beats them all up, then passes out again. Now, this doesn't happen often, but one thing I will say for Zack Snyder, the guy understands visuals, even if he understands almost nothing else. His decision to film the Bible cut with no more than one light on set at any given moment was unquestionably the right one, given the designs of the characters, and Joss Whedon opting for a color scheme that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Nintendo game was by far one of his worst decisions. This whole scene, though, recreates Whedon's folly, or, well, the other Whedon's folly. Jesus Christ, they're all fucking at it. Because here, we're shooting on a very obvious soundstage, and the green screen and lighting are designed to give the impression of a bright, crisp Arctic morning, which is disastrous for characters whose whole design was modelled with the presumption of a Snyder-esque noir fest. Neither Batman nor the Flash are meant to be seen in the full light of day, and the overall quality of the CGI in this film is risible even in the dark. Here it has nowhere to hide and is just absolutely fucking tragic. If it weren't for the fact that the rest of the film isn't any better, I'd have sworn this film was a late and rushed reshoot. Or a cutscene in a very poor video game. I mean, just yuck.
What atrocity is this?
It's not just the textures, though they are positively criminal, it's everything. The movements, the still shots, the way you can tell most of the people involved aren't really there. In here, for instance, we're meant to believe old Batman is punching someone while deflecting a bullet, but I mean, just look at his face. Look at it. It is just, no. They all hop back aboard the Batplane and head home. Old Bruce is patching himself up, and this, by contrast, is quite well done. Despite his injuries, he seems now to be more alive, like he's kind of enjoyed being shot at and fighting bad guys and completing missions again. He's going on a bit of a journey. The Barrys, meanwhile, are watching another news report about Zod's ship that's still chilling somewhere over a desert in order that the final battle not cost too much to animate. Barry Prime begins fretting that there are good Kryptonians and bad Kryptonians, and they have no way of knowing whether the one they've just brought home is the former. Then she wakes up and demands to know who they are. We learn that she is not Superman as they had hoped, but she is Supergirl, not Kal-El, but Karen. And that joke really is just wordplay, by the way. She's actually one of the film's stronger constituents, and a rare reminder that I'm not 100% gay. In this universe, baby Kal-El left Krypton in an escape pod, and an older Karen here is his cousin. She went with him as his protector, though they were somehow separated before reaching Earth. She learns Zod is here, and she tries to leave, but she's too weak, so Barry Prime tells old Barry to take her out to the roof and put it in the sun, because she's solar-powered. It is worth mentioning, though, that for all the film does a good-ish job introducing this character, and she's competently performed, it has chosen to do this with little more than half an hour left on the clock. That is not much time. Frankly, it's not enough time to avoid rushing her along in a great many important respects. Recall that a significant chunk of Justice League, especially the Bible cut, is devoted to the question of Superman's resurrection. Should it be done? What happens if it is done? Oh no, he has no memories of this place. He perceives familiar things as a threat. There's nothing we can do to stop him. This is faintly terrifying. Easy to see how this could lead to a post-apocalyptic nightmare scenario in which Superman destroys the world. Less easy to see why he'd do this by shacking up with the parademons of Darkseid, but never mind. Their premise was interesting enough. And it's not that dissimilar to Supergirl's introduction here. As she regains her strength, her powers come back. Her ears are assaulted by all the noises of the earth. They disorient her. For about 2 seconds, then it's never relevant again. Old Barry tells her Zod will kill lots of innocent people, but she turns to him in anger and says that she and Superbaby came here looking for a safe place to live, and the first thing that happened to her was these good people locking her in a giant Siberian bollock prison, which she's understandably rather salty about. See the similarities here? Unfamiliar world, disoriented, no memories to fall back on, proximate experience of pain and suffering, no moral attachment to place or people, all the powers required to end it. But whereas a good part of Snyder's story was about this in relation to Superman, and so for all the film's faults, it does come across as a serious and tense setup with a realizably terrible and frightening possible failure scenario, in this film we don't get any of that. It repeats some of the motions but with none of the stakes or threat. Reviving her wasn't a desperate gamble, it happened purely by accident. Her antipathy to the world isn't solved with a character payoff like Lois Lane talking Superman down even as he's wiping out the Justice League. Supergirl here just doesn't like humans until a couple of scenes later she figures that maybe she does. Which again contributes to the feeling, correctly I'd add, that none of this is really about her. She's an asset to be used to pad out an inconsequential alternate dimension, a what-if character the writers figured they might as well use because she's kind of familiar and hasn't been utilized on screen in this cast combination before. We still don't know how the Ruskies ever managed to put her in the testicle to begin with either, but given the film doesn't have enough time to actually flesh out important parts of her character and her relationship with the world, you can be damn sure it won't try to answer that question either. All we need to know about her for now is that she's pissed off, and so she flies off. Oh dear. It's time for the plot to move on again, and true to form, this involves Barry Prime coming up with a harebrained scheme he had no reason not to think of much earlier than he did. On this occasion, he decides he wants his powers back, so he wants to recreate the accident that gave him his powers so he can regain the Speed Force, and that would give them a chance against Zod. Or, you know, allow him to go home and stop fucking up the past. Although come to that, if we've now established that he's on an entirely different timeline, how does he even hope to go home? Is it even possible anymore? Will we ever find out? Well, that's a question for later, but for now the question is, why, given you had a pressing need to go home earlier in the film, didn't you think to recreate the experiment several days ago? Then again, how can you hope to recreate the experiment, given you don't know the precise mix of the chemicals the lightning fused with that give you these powers to begin with? There is no answer to the first one. The film's answer to the second is, chemicals? It's fine, it'll be fine, don't worry about it. I mean, now look here, film, I'm not the kind of guy who's likely to forgive you forgetting the events of earlier films, so I'm absolutely not going to forgive you for forgetting what happened barely an hour ago. If all he needs to do is to regain his powers is, in fact, to be struck by lightning and covered with any random combination of nebulous chemicals, why hasn't he tried this already? There are plenty of ways to get yourself zapped by lightning or high voltage electricity in general. Old Bruce raises a salient if problematic question. If he succeeds in getting his powers back, he has the ability to travel to any time, to any timeline he chooses. Not sure that's been established, but we'll run with it. Which is problematic because we've not established he has the ability to choose which timeline he ends up in, but the general thrust of the inquiry is correct. He can go to a different timeline, whether or not he gets to choose which. So, that being the case, Alt Bruce asks, why would you stay to fight for this one? Barry Prime replies, because this is the world where my mum lives, I went back in time to save her, I'm not going to lose her again. And I'm sorry to do this, but no? Fair enough, you went back in time to save your mum on the presumption that time was linear, and you could then hop back to the present, even though you've said you've read all about temporal paradoxes and such, so you had no reason to make that assumption. You then got trapped here, but were still keenly aware that your presence would cause immense, even cataclysmic damage to the multiverse, so you need to go home. Though you subsequently invented a huge number of reasons not to do that, which we could explain potentially if you assume either that time is linear, or that you're trapped in this universe so it's the only timeline you'll ever know going forward, even though you'd previously concocted a plan to get Alt Flash to take you home, and have now concocted a plan to get the powers back that Alt Bruce says can take you anywhere to any timeline, of which there are potentially infinite varieties. You've learned that there are infinite potential timelines. You have not, to my recollection, decided that your mother's death occurs in all of them, and even if you could make that unsafe assumption, there is no reason, if you have your powers back, that you couldn't hop across and save her in a different timeline in the hopes either that Zod doesn't show up, or the metahumans and Superman still exist, because it stands to reason that you cannot determine the events of a new timeline the exact same way each time, not least since you know not to repeat the mistakes you made this time, producing then an exponentially differing set of results. In other words, I fucking loathe multiverses because none of this makes any goddamn sense. The defense will be his motive and character journey, but we've yet to separate the undeniable emotional appeal they possess from the means chosen to exploit that emotional appeal. If Barry Prime is trapped here and cannot leave, making this functionally the only universe in which his mum can live, then fair enough, he has a reason to stay and fight. But everything about this film's multiversal exposition works against that motive because it simply isn't true. The writers need him to stay and fight for this universe. The universe and the character as described do not. Alt Bruce then begins what is almost a very powerful speech about his scars making him who he is, about his lifetime spent trying to right the wrongs of the past. It's a more fleshed out and feeling version of the speech Bruce Prime gave at the beginning of the film, right before he got bored of the conversation and went home, thereby ensuring this terrible thing he knew was terrible could terribly occur. I say it's almost powerful because the close rather undercuts the setup. This is a "your loss makes you who you are" speech, but Alt Bruce then says the lifetime spent trying to right the wrongs of the past was a vague expression of the want to bring his parents back, and he says, "You actually did it, so do you want some help?" So, to be clear, he spent a lifetime trying to fix the wrongs of the past, but came to the conclusion that his flaws and failures make him who he is. He understands the mechanics of time travel and multiverses and their dangers, and is the one who first broaches the possibility that there are certain interlocking moments that are set across the multiverse that cannot be changed. And then he turns to Barry Prime, who has just broken the laws and caused multiversal chaos and potentially the end of this entire universe and the deaths of everyone involved in it, in a bid to fix something that could well be unfixable because he wants to mend the past and not let it define him. And Alt Bruce says, sure, fine. What? No. Sometimes you can see the through line in a tangled mess of a script. Sometimes, despite everything, you can see what the film is trying to achieve. And there's often merit in the idea, if not in the delivery. But in this case, I am genuinely confused about what the idea and the delivery are. I really don't know what the film is going for with this one. What message is it trying to convey here? Why is Alt Bruce saying what he's saying? Why is he doing what he's doing? And what lesson is anyone, in universe or out universe, supposed to take from that? What lesson is Barry Prime in particular supposed to take from all of this? Oh, and just by the by, old Barry is sitting beneath them in the Batcave eating a bat banana, and he overhears their conversation, which is the first time he learns that his mum was supposed to die. This might be relevant later, well, it kind of is. We'll get there. Supergirl, meanwhile, is still flying around in a huff. She flies all the way over to Zod's ship, hovering over the desert, and arrives in time to see him land in front of the human army. Ostensibly, we infer, meant to be handing her over, as was the terms of the ultimatum set by Zod however long ago it was. The fact he so rarely features in this film is peculiar, by the way. He's like an emergency plot focusing button that the writers smash just every now and then when they need to make progress and can't think of another way to do it. But it's uncanny because, even though there's this giant alien death ship hovering over the planet and humans have made first contact with extraterrestrials, and the extraterrestrials have threatened to blow up the world unless they get what they want, the plot hasn't found the space to really integrate that into the world that it's depicting. Resultingly, the film feels like what it is, a what-if story that presumes the premise is so well known that it's at liberty to shift the focus entirely away from it in order to laser in on its protagonist's moral almost journey. It does do good things with Barry Prime, it's done some already and it will do heavier lifting later, but its myopia makes for a very unbalanced script, where we scene hop and jump about to precisely where we need to be to force a lesson on Barry Prime, but not in a way that conveys the sense of being in a living world. Zod exists when on screen, ceases to exist off screen until it's time for him to be on screen again. The film is paying obeisance after a fashion to the world Zack Snyder was building and the style by which he did it. This is, I think, our fifth perspective on Zod. We had Superman's direct perspective in Man of Steel, we had Bruce's by one remove in Batman v Superman, we had Luthor's in Justice League, and this film has given us Barry Prime's main timeline perspective at the beginning. Each of those is firmly grounded in character, even if the consequences are pretty messy, especially in Batman v Superman. Now we have our fifth perspective, and it's the first one that's abstracted and depersonalized. Supergirl sees his initial attack on the humans, but that's really just a manufactured pretext to define her as a hero. She left Wayne Manor very angry at humanity in general, with no preconceived attachment to it, and quite flippant about their destruction at Zod's hands. She flies over, she sees Zod attacking human soldiers who were supposed to be handing her over, she says, "No!" And this is what passes for her moral arc. Zod goes on to be a character magnet for the final act, but again in a depersonalized way. We're not going to see him through any particular character's eyes in this film. It's not going to form their values, or teach them directly anything about themselves we don't already know. Because all this is mere events, the film is a Barry Allen biopic. And Zod and his consequences, like our ancillary cast of cameos, are kind of circumstantial for reasons we will come back to. But since this could be the last time any of this is relevant, it's probably worth pointing out that there was this semblance of a good idea underpinning Zod's appearances from the various perspectives across the earlier films in the soon-to-be redundant DCU. His arrival is a hinge event in history. It's consequential for reasons well beyond his character and his immediate role. Zod's arrival on Earth is the arrival of most members of the Justice League, in differing ways and from differing positions. The delivery was never quite there because turning premise into story is not Zack Snyder's forte, but the premise itself is laudable. Repeat references to single events from different perspectives is a good way of structuring an expanded universe. Order 66 in Star Wars is a good comparison, because it's been repeatedly referenced in much the same way, and with a similar lack of tact and finesse. The story arcs that spring up around Age of Ultron in the MCU is another example of the same trick, or the relationship between the plots of the first Avengers film and Spider-Man Homecoming. The Flash's harking back to Zod's arrival is by some distance the least compelling and useful of all the DCU's returns to this moment, further muddled by the fact this isn't really the same hinge event because we're in a different timeline and multiverses ruin fucking everything. But it is proof that something will be lost if James Gunn nukes the whole thing. Some semblance of a world has been built here, and for all I'll happily shit on Zack Snyder for a million reasons, he did grasp that fictional universes revolve around singular events just as our own world does, and the Snyderverse consequently was never an empty thing or an unsalvageable thing. It would, without irony, have been better had DC let him complete his story, not only because it would close off several hundred boring Snyder fan arguments, but also because the result, messy though it would have been, wouldn't have been as messy as all of this. But hey-ho, back to the Flash. Supergirl, having observed this and had her perfunctory moment of moral awakening that places her firmly on the side of the humans. She does not stay and fight Zod, but rather goes all the way back to Wayne Manor to reunite with the people she just abandoned, whom she doesn't know, about whose powers and abilities she is almost entirely unaware, having been unconscious during her rescue and overpowering when she rescued them from the mercenaries. Safety in numbers might be the reason, I guess we'll have to run with that as the assumption. It's not a ridiculous assumption, but it does bespeak a shallowness of every character in this film not named Barry that motives have to be as vague as all that. It is, though, a good job she decided to go back for reinforcements, because the experiment to give Barry Prime his powers back is not going particularly well. He's rigged up to a chair surrounded by chemicals, and a bat kite is floating in the sky high above that duly attracts lightning to zap him, but it doesn't work. He, though nearly dead, wants to be zapped again. But the machinery is now all fried, and anyway, aren't the chemicals all trashed now? Speaking of, how did they know which chemicals to use, and why does Bruce just happen to have a whole research lab's worth of funny colored liquids on hand? Might the fact this experiment didn't work have anything to do with the fact they've just had a wild guess as to the correct cocktail of drugs and medicines and acids and such? All looks distinctly ill, and Barry Prime looks very ill, but Supergirl arrives just in time and she carries him high up into the sky to be zapped again by lightning, but sans the chemicals this time, so naturally this time it works. Oh, fuck it, I don't care. Okay, fine film, just you can have that. It's a fairly uplifting scene, not just because she's literally lifting him up, but it might have been nice had it been paying off something more concrete. I don't believe she's even been shown being aware of his problem and the loss of his powers. She fucked off before he or old Barry had a chance to explain anything to her. It does pay off the moral awakening that led to her return, though again, for reasons previously explained, this is a very shallow thing, and consequently the reward is meager. She doesn't have a particular relationship with him to speak of, because she only popped up in the film 10 minutes ago, and has only had a single interaction with Barry Prime, so there's not really any kind of budding relationship to further by this act. It does, though, succeed in restoring Barry Prime's powers to him, which of course reopens all the unanswered and unanswerable questions about his motives, abilities, why he doesn't immediately use the time warp to return to his own world or restart at a different one, or anything else you could conceivably imagine, because there's an infinite multiverse now, and they suck infinite donkey balls. I will say, though, that for all it doesn't really feel earned in any meaningful way, the scene is pretty well acted by all concerned, particularly by Ezra Miller. Say what you will about Twat, and yes, overacting in certain scenes is a legitimate criticism, but Twat can be versatile, and this scene brings out the best of the two versions of Twat's self. Well done. You're good at grooming yourself, now go back to rehab. While Barry is recuperating, old Barry sets about crafting a second flash suit out of old bits of Batman armor. Luckily, it has exactly the right properties, I guess. Luckily, he knows what those properties are, though I'm not sure he ever learned or even had the time to learn them properly. He seems to be sticking various bits together with hazard tape, and I'm not an expert in the properties of tape, but I'd be willing to put money on it not being able to withstand massive electrical charges built up by superspeed static that tends to set things on fire. Barry Prime eventually wakes up, and old Barry gives him the suit ring back. It's not all that clear how much time has passed, by the way, and you will recall that however long ago it was, we left off with Zod's evil armies laying waste to their human defenders in a desert. It was daylight then, it's nighttime now, so a charitable interpretation has it that all the proceeding has taken maybe 6 hours. That's 6 hours in which powerless Earth defenders get slaughtered by Zod and his armies. So I'm sure we won't go back to find him in exactly the same place, involved in exactly the same fight, right? Nah, I mean, that would be ridiculous. There's no way that would happen. It'll definitely happen, won't it? Before we get back to the super urgent quest to stop Zod destroying the world, we get a brief moment of interaction between Supergirl and Barry Prime. She asks why he helped her even though she wasn't Kal-El, and he says, because you needed help. She explains that Krypton was beautiful and her people are people of hope, not of war, and although Zod is from Krypton, he isn't good people. Okay. Consequently, she'll help Barry Prime fight Zod, rightio. So what was the point of her little sojourn across the world and back? Surely she didn't need to see Zod shooting humans she didn't even like at that point to decide that he's not good people. Also, didn't she take a huge risk making herself known to Zod? She says no, and somehow the sound carries and he sees her. Has he got no way of tracking her, or even doing a best guesstimate as to where she went? She's the whole reason he's here, but he hasn't yet reacted to her at all because he's not been on screen, and as we all know, people who are off screen are effectively static until the camera returns. Fine. It conflicts too with her original angry chat with old Barry, where she was dismissive of Zod's genocidal intent because she didn't like the humans she'd met very much. I suppose seeing Zod's violence with her own eyes might have prompted her to reconsider, to realize she'd been rash and angry and lacking judgment, though I think we'd have to read that very deliberately into the film because it's not conveyed particularly well, if it's conveyed at all. Somewhat better realized is old Bruce's conversion to the cause. He began by promising to help find Superman, and that's pretty much it. Then we were clearly shown him post-battle looking alive and energized and purposeful again, so his reappearance to join the Alt Justice League and the battle against Zod is comparatively well supported. And so we're back off to the desert, and the trip there throws back up, or rather regurgitates, the problem I mentioned earlier about this hollow and unfocused world. It's left to Barry Prime in a bit of spiritless exposition to tell Alt Barry that Zod controls the world engine, and he says, and I quote, "It'll be destroying much more than just Metropolis now." So tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people are probably already dead. One of the greatest cities on Earth is being wrecked, much more will be besides, and in fact this entire world with all of its 8 billion inhabitants has been summoned into existence by the Flash in a selfish bid to bring his parents back, so all the deaths are kind of on him as well, but we get none of that. We don't really ever grapple with any of this. The first we learn of the likely fate of Metropolis is in this exposition dump right here, now in the cockpit of the Batplane, with absolutely nobody registering that it might be a serious piece of news with dire consequences. And it's not just that they fail to register it, because old Barry is back to being an insufferable teenager again, and he's too busy recording videos of Supergirl flying to pay attention to news of unimaginable slaughter and destruction. This thing will recur before the end, but judging by his bashful look, I think the writers might have had it in mind to tease a romantic relationship of sorts between Old Flash and Supergirl. There's occasional little bits of evidence of it still lingering in the script, but it feels very much like the substantial part of it has been cut out. Since there's barely half an hour left and a final battle to fight and a multiverse arc to wrap up, you can be damn sure we're not going to have that fully fleshed out at any point. Their plan is for the Barrys to take on the entire Kryptonian army to give Supergirl enough time to take on Zod, while old Batman provides Bat air support in his Batplane. Which sounds both simple and impossible, but the film seems to think it's only the first of these that's the problem, not the second, so it throws in the added complication of the human forces not recognizing them, and so considering them part of Zod's forces, and they fire on them as well. This is explained when old Batman expresses his surprise that, and I quote,
"The humans we came to protect
are firing on them." Bruce, my dude, you are a human. You're all humans. Everyone in this cockpit is a human. The only non-human with you isn't in the cockpit, she's flying outside. Humans do not typically designate themselves as humans. People might have been a better word to use there, my friend. Anywho, Batman bat drops them off in the middle of the endless desert that Zod hasn't left yet for some reason, in among the humans who aren't dead yet for some reason, and who were just shooting at them a second ago, but will entirely forget to do that from this point onwards. And we get one of the dodgy CGI shots from the trailers. Now, as mentioned, the director Andy Muschietti has hit back at critics of the CGI by explaining that this was always supposed to look weird and shit. He explained it in the context of that microwave baby scene, arguing that it was all because it was from the Flash's perspective, but this scene isn't, and this scene looks like garbage, and the rest of the film looks like garbage, so once again I have to point out that you are talking lies, my friend. Zod wanders out onto the deck of his ship, and Supergirl immediately takes out the only two guards he brought with him. Top distraction work by the Flashes there, glad to see that painstakingly laid out battle plan bearing fruits already. No other guards even attempt to come out and stop her. She's just left alone with Zod himself so they can have an uninterrupted chat. Meanwhile, out in the endlessly flat desert, the fighting continues. Now, you can understand why the writers would want to stage the fight in the desert, to avoid all the touchy questions about collateral damage and such, but much more importantly, it is a lot easier to animate. The problem, though, is that it all becomes kind of lifeless and grey and samey. There's no tactics in play. The human soldiers and their tanks just run aimlessly forward and get twatted occasionally by Kryptonians, or else just disappear into the smoke, or the endless backdrop of flatness. The film tries to inject a bit of variety into affairs by having, by my count, a whopping 3 enemy types: big flying ships, generic Kryptonian soldiers, and one evil space giant with a big hammer who serves as a kind of battlefield surrogate for the main villain, because Zod is still busy chatting with Supergirl and he plays a suspiciously small role in the fight itself. Human soldiers and tanks and Humvees alike all obligingly and deliberately move into the evil space giant's melee attack range in order that they be twatted away. And you're left wondering just what their plan is, and why they've all opted to run out into the middle of an open desert carrying their ranged weapons into the melee strike distance of an enemy who couldn't shoot back if they all just stayed away. Where's their artillery? Why are helicopters just buzzing around in the immediate airspace doing nothing? We only see a couple of fighter jets involved, and even then, they're on screen just momentarily. It all contributes to the blandness of this supposedly epic battle. These people clearly aren't people, they're not intelligent, self-aware creatures, they don't seem all that afraid of death, and so we don't feel all that fearful or sorry when they blunder into Space Giant's death hammer. It's just miniature action figures being smashed together by an abnormally disinterested child. A good final battle is a desperate, frenetic thing. They're miniature stories in their own right, often with 3-act structures, dramatic arrival, mid-act setback for the heroes, triumphant overcoming of vast evil. They don't leave you very much time to think. Their combatants are aware of the desperateness of their situation and they act accordingly. They don't, as the Flashes do in this one, stand around in the middle of the action in a wide open plain, wearing very distinctive red suits, talking to and quipping at each other. They're not at all involved in the action during these scenes, they give the strong impression they are not really there, which they aren't. Though that impression is also conveyed by the fact we get people and vehicles going in all directions in the backdrop frequently, heading toward absolutely nothing except the infinitely vast flatness of the future, and not, notably, shooting at the Flashes, which the film pretended for all of 5 seconds would be a threat, or at least a complicating factor. They even find the time to drop in a fucking Barbie reference.
Come on, Barbie. Let's go party?
Like, why exactly do I give a shit about any of this? What's the point in it? Again, I can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm going to have to say it. You wouldn't have got that from a Zack Snyder film. The Flashes do eventually flash into action, albeit by this point their area of the fight is notably empty of pretty much everyone. There's a few random vehicles scattered about, but otherwise it's isolated enemies who have no business being where they are, save that it's where the film wants them to be at that given moment. One of them manages to /alt-flash across the face, because they are surprisingly quick, being Kryptonians, though given we've been shown him trying every possible combination in a 9-digit keypad in the blink of an eye, and being faster than bullets as well, I don't think they could ever have been fast enough to do that, but the scar will be relevant later though, so just bear with it. In all that intervening time, Zod and Supergirl have been on pause, because remember, nothing off-screen moves. We now flash back to pick up the conversation they've obligingly stalled to wait for the camera to return. Zod listlessly informs us,
"Terraforming has begun. This world must die."
Good for you, champ. Could have put a bit more feeling into that. The point of this exchange is to pretend like Supergirl isn't just a cameo and actually has a meaningful role in the story. So Zod informs us that her uncle put the key to Krypton's rebirth in the body of a Kryptonian child. And we're all familiar with this story, right? It's Kal-El, Superman himself. But remember, this is an alternate universe. So we learn that Zod and his forces captured little baby Kal and tried to get the key out of him, only to find that it wasn't him to begin with, and he died. They killed him.
Kal-El No.
I'm sorry, Al, do you want to try that one more time for us?
Kal-El No. Kal-El No.
Yeah, good one. That's a big improvement, thanks. That's a wrap. No, it wasn't Kal-El who held the key, it was Karen, which is confusing, because Kal-El was a baby when he was sent away, and we've explicitly been told that she was sent along to protect him, meaning she can't have been a baby at the time, right? But if she wasn't a baby at the time, why didn't she remember having the key to the revival of Krypton placed in her? And that seems like the kind of thing you might notice. And why hasn't she aged, for that matter? And it can't be that she knew but has been hiding the fact, because if that were so, why would she believe she'd been sent along to protect Kal-El? And then why, for that matter, would you go to the added complication of sending the last son of Krypton, who is in fact unimportant, and hiding the key in a bodyguard? Yeah, it's a little bit muddled, And Zod is here breaking that rule the Incredibles established so well, he's monologuing. His sole driving motive is to get a hold of the complete genetic code he needs to recreate Krypton on Earth. It's right here in front of him. He's already missed this chance once. Why, in the name of all of fuckery, is he just prancing around talking at her? Why aren't there more guards here? Why isn't she the sole focus of his entire army, presently pissing about in the eternal desert? Credit to the actress, she plays her part well. She captures that raw, desperate anger on the news of her baby cousin's death. She conveys it. She's also very pretty. Good stuff. Shame about pretty much everything else. She blasts Zod off his balcony and out of his monologue and down into the distressingly bland battlefield below. I mean, just what is even going on down there? Look at that mess. Where have they come from? Where did they go? Where did they come from, Cotton-Eyed Joe? Supergirl starts throwing Zod around, and this is Batman's cue to return to the film. He's just kicked off the aerial battle he said he'd kick off several minutes ago. The Flashes, meanwhile, are learning to fight together because, happily, they have the freedom of the battlefield to talk to each other and offer tips and encouragement before taking on the enemies who come at them obligingly, one at a time, and it all smells distinctly of cheap. It's tonally balked as well. We've just come out of what should have been a desperate revelation for Supergirl, and indeed the whole world. Superman is dead. They killed him when he was just a baby. She conveyed that raw mix of anger and bitter grief. It's a decent premise for a fight scene. But now, seconds later, we're away with the Flashes doing comic relief stuff while they beat up enemies to some pop rock song.
What did you do?
The infant did not survive.
At least it'll smooth the transition to the Gunverse, but it's still a wasted opportunity. Speaking of Supergirl, she's busy pummeling Zod into the hull of a crashed helicopter, where he for some reason gets stuck. I really want to care about their fight, but I can't, because we keep cutting away to pop music and light shows. This is the point at which the film begins to rediscover what it wants the point of all this to be. Old Batman, though he knows the big alien ships are shielded, because he's seen it already in this fight, decides he wants to take one out, so he flies right at it, shoots at it, predictably fails to destroy it, and winds up dying. Meanwhile, Supergirl doesn't think it worth checking whether Zod is actually dead or even unconscious before she goes for the wrist computer that controls the world engines, and while she's distracted by that, he stabs her and she dies. Oh no. Now, the film does have a point to make with this, as mentioned, but as seems always to be the case, it's so bedazzled by its own big idea that it pays absolutely no attention to how it gets there. So, you're telling me that Batman, who knows the big ships are shielded, voluntarily and stupidly goes on a suicide run to try and take one out? Why? That's an incredibly stupid thing to have done. You're telling me that the Flash, who can run so fast that time effectively stops, or even reverses, but we'll get to that, makes no effort to try and help him before his Batplane crashes and Bat explodes? Similarly, but more stupidly, you're telling me that Supergirl, who is on an angry, single-minded vengeance quest against Zod for killing her baby cousin, suddenly forgets that she's hellbent on killing him, and instead goes for the wrist computer to solve somebody else's problem without first checking whether Zod is likely to stab her in the back? I mean, that is, put politely, incredibly fucking dumb. You're telling me that the Flash, who has already reversed time several times across these last few films in order to put right momentary mistakes, doesn't do that here and pop up to warn her before she gets stabbed? But it has to happen, because there's a point to it, you see. The point is that Flash needs to learn that there are some things you can't fix, because mistakes and tragedy help make us who we are, etc. Or, you know, at least to momentarily learn this before he forgets it instantly, but we'll get to that. So, everything having gone horribly wrong, the Flashes meet again in the obligingly empty battlefield. Old Flash says that they can fix things, they can go back in time, like Flash Prime did originally. Flash Prime responds, "You're not fast enough yet." Well, no, but there are two of you, dude. You can do that as well, remember? It's how you got here. Anyway, shut up, that's not the point. The point, and to give the film its due, I like what it is trying to do, is that he, older and wiser, is coming slowly to a realization that old Flash, younger and more impulsive and headstrong, is not. You cannot fix everything. He's not fully there yet, but he is close to that moment of recognition, while old Flash hasn't even begun to conceptualize it. He's still bedazzled by possibilities. Which even in this early stage is clever-ish. The film has mature and immature Barry standing side by side, and is using this to illustrate the journey Flash Prime has been on. Yeah, I do like what it's trying to do. Old Flash proves him wrong. He is fast enough. And I get the sense, again, that the film wanted to create more of a relationship between he and Supergirl, and to have her death as his triggering incident, the thing that gives him sufficient rage and so sufficient power to do the time warp. That, I'm morally certain, is why it's he who goes to her corpse, not Flash Prime, and why he's more visibly upset by her death than Flash Prime is. I don't know if that material was cut, or whether it was never more than a vague sentiment on the writer's part that seeped into the script without ever being actualized, but I'd be very surprised to learn that I'm wrong about this. Flash Prime catches up with Old Flash and they do the time warp together. Old Flash says, "You know what I'm gonna change? I know what I'm gonna change. I know what I'm gonna change." And we'll just hold up just 1 minute, film, because you explained how this works earlier. By making these changes, aren't they creating a whole new timeline with a different past and a different future? Isn't that how this is supposed to go? How do they know they'll be re-entering the same universe rather than a different one? How do they know all the same people will be there? If they do know it's a different universe but they don't care, which would be dumb and which the film doesn't state, so that's probably not the reason, then I go back to the question I raised all that time ago. Why is Barry Prime fighting to save one specific universe when he could save his mother in one with more favorable conditions? But sod it, we progress back in time, and since the film requires us to just accept it, we'll accept that it is the same timeline and that time has become linear again. Old Batman goes on his suicide run, but Flash Prime reminds him that the big ship has shields, so he aborts the run. Instead, he goes after the evil space giant who was introduced earlier for no other reason than to set up this scene. Although as the biggest battlefield threat, you might have thought the Flashes would have taken him out first. Old Batman decides the best way to take out a ground-based opponent armed exclusively with a melee weapon is to fly straight at him and get close enough for him to jump at you with his giant hammer. Good one. Evil space giant jumps onto the Batplane, grabs on, Batman tries spinning because that's a good trick, but the Batplane gets taken out. Though he does escape in time and flies down in a glossy, shiny CGI catastrophe. Old Flash, meanwhile, goes off to help Supergirl, distracting Zod for a minute until he uses his own super speed to break out of the Flash's whirlwind, knocking Supergirl into a daze and then stabbing her so she dies again. Oh no. Old Batman does marginally better against the evil space giant, managing to knock it out, but he dies in the attempt, which would have been a bit of a bland send-off, albeit one that does do some justice to his character and that does hark back to the fate mechanic teased earlier. Kneeling over him as he dies, Flash Prime says, "We can't bring you back, can we?" Recognizing that this moment might be one of those multiversal inevitabilities, and that's very dicey because remember in his universe, none of this happened to begin with and Bruce is alive, which means this moment isn't a multiversal inevitability, but anyway, the film needs it to be an inevitability, otherwise the plot doesn't work. Bruce replies, "You already have," which is nice, I like that. As mentioned, old Bruce does have something like an arc in this film. It's simple, it's basic, it did rely on deconstructing him first, but at least it took care to rebuild something. Anyway, he's dead now. Space Giant gets up and the Flashes zap it with electricity and explode it, leaving us to wonder why they didn't just do that earlier, or try going back in time to do it earlier and giving Bruce another chance. The explosion sends shards of armor flying through the air, and one of them gets lodged in old Flash's arm, creating a big metal scythe thing, which you'd think would hurt like hell and be pretty debilitating, but no, he's already using it as a weapon, and now he's off to do the time warp and to try to fix everything again. Now this upcoming dynamic is powerful for the reasons previously given, but the longer this is going on, the less sense it's making. I've not exhausted all the reasons the multiverse system makes no sense in this film, because there are infinite reasons, but I've exhausted myself and probably you with the list already given. So just multiply that by infinity and you'll be fine. It makes no sense. There is no solid, stateable reason why they are where they are, doing what they're doing. The second increasingly nonsensical thing, though, is old Flash himself. Now, we know what the film is trying to do here, as mentioned. It's using the contrast between mature and immature Barry to demonstrate the journey he's been on and the lessons he's learned, with old Barry as the dramatic contrast. That's fine, that's good even, or it would be, it could be, except where has all of this really come from in old Barry's case? We understood Barry Prime's motive for doing the time warp initially, though he still shouldn't have done it. He's grown up without parents. His desperation has had most of his lifetime to develop. It's fermented. It's increased with each new failure and tragedy. His attempts to get his dad out of jail that go awry, that sense of cosmic injustice is a part of his character. It's what the film is starting to have him realize. Old Barry, though, has none of that. He doesn't have that history. He's been the blithe, flippant, insufferable teenager for the vast majority of the film. It's qualified by the fact that he learns secondhand that Barry Prime's mother is dead in his universe, but that revelation hasn't changed much about his character, and it's not yet his motive for constantly wanting to rerun the future. He's not had no arc, but he's had a much smaller one, and his starting position isn't desperation, it's naivety. In the space of this film, or a few days in universe, he's reached something like the position the much older Barry began the film in, which would be clever if only it made more sense. His behavior now isn't entirely without supporting character work, but the more you linger on it, the more you're left feeling that the work has barely really begun, never mind progressed far enough to make this desperate drive for eternal repetition explicable. Because you might remember way back near the beginning that Flash Prime got swatted out of the time warp by some bizarre interdimensional Flash Vortex monster. Well, as I'm sure you'll have already worked out, that Flash monster is old Flash himself. He has replayed the battle over and over and over again, who knows how many times, And the various injuries he's picked up along the way, the various bits of shrapnel embedded in his skin, the fire wounds, the scorch marks, they are what's deformed him and charred him and reduced him to the Vortex Monster. And I really want to like this, but it just makes no fucking sense. He's not been replaying this same battle by the laws of the film, he's been creating infinite new timelines in which this same battle takes place. But the same battle can't take place at the same time every time, because it didn't take place in at least one other universe we know of, Barry Prime's home dimension. And it can't proceed the same way because Barry Prime isn't there for most of them, he's still wallowing around in the time vortex. And by the logic previously established in the film, that law of retrocausality that means new universes spawn with entirely different histories as well as futures, he never was present. And if he never was, then why is that battle even taking place? And if it didn't take place, Old Flash would quickly wind up in a universe where he has no one to save, meaning he doesn't constantly replay the fight, and he cannot be here now, and he cannot have turned into the Vortex Monster because the Vortex Monster has no reason to be. At least I think that's how all of this should work. It doesn't work though, and I just fucking hate multiverses, so moving on. So all this plays out as described, doing a good job of portraying Old Flash's fanatic desperation, but a bad job at making anything make sense. Old Flash trying again and again, failing again and again, he pops back into the time warp. Flash Prime tells him he has to undo what he did, meaning he has to undo saving his mother. She has to die. You'll note that this seems not to have been front and center of Old Flash's mind in his eternal attempts to fix things. He just wants to stop Supergirl and Batman from dying for reasons. Is he really aware of the consequences of their deaths? He's not been shown to care all that much, or have a mind to long-term consequences. That's kind of why he's doing this now. And he seldom listened when Barry Prime tried to explain the stakes to him. Having old Barry broach the saving of their mother would have helped the scene tremendously, but that would have required the film showed him growing up into a more rounded awareness of the stakes, which it should have done but didn't. And that itself would have posed problems because if old Barry really grasped the stakes, he would have realized that Flash Prime created this entire universe and was about to be responsible for the deaths of 8 billion people because he was selfish. That, you could do powerful things with that as well, but again, the film doesn't seem to have recognized that's what it's done. Flash Prime explains that this is one of those set events that cannot be changed. Not his mother dying, I don't think, but the death of that specific world. So, world deaths are unchanging, inevitable consequences of changed events, but how does that tie in with every other example of the type so far given? Like the fact that Bruce's seem always to have Alfred's. World death can't be a timeline consequence, as evidenced by the fact that Flash Prime's world isn't dead. So we are expected, I think, to work our way back to the death of his mother as the event that can't be changed? Except that also doesn't work, because even if you say it multiversally follows that Flash doesn't become the Flash if his mother survives, the film never even tried to explain why the Flash not becoming the Flash in the same way as he did originally logically means there are no other metahumans, and no Superman to stop Zod, leading inevitably to world death. But if world death isn't the inevitable multiversal response to Barry saving his mum, then once again, there are infinite universes out there where she could be saved without causing the apocalypse, or even worlds where she never dies. And that could be so even if you accept, as the film has never stated, that there is only one universe until Flash first used the time warp in this film, because old Bruce explained that creating new timelines has retrocausal effects, some of which might be that his mum never died. And you know what? Fuck it. We get the payoff. Flash Prime tells old Flash that not every problem has a solution, though in an infinite multiverse they probably do. It's a repeat of his mum's line from the first flashback scene, where he's struggling with his homework, though the problem here is the same as the problem there. You don't need every solution, you just need a sufficient one. This is the moment old Flash realizes Flash Prime means he has to let go of their mum, though Flash Prime complicates this by saying that she will always be alive somewhere in time. And fuck it, I'm not going to go back over why none of this works. Flash Prime says he's going back to undo his mistake. Old Flash says, "No, you're not, I want another chance." He fucks off. And then, Monster Vortex Flash Guy appears and chains Flash Prime in place so he cannot leave. Flash, for some reason, decides the most tonally appropriate thing to do here is to quip at him, long enough for old Flash to return, so now there are 3 of them together. And I think this is where the rest of the CGI budget was spent. Their coexistence here is causing various different universes to collapse in on themselves, which is an excuse for a cameo fest complete with de-aged Christopher Reeve, various depictions of various DC mainstays throughout history, PS3 Nicolas Cage as Superman, And if you just turn your brain off, it's all fairly good fun. But since you're this far into this video, I assume you prefer thinking about movies, so you'll understand if I don't try and make sense of it, because it isn't meant to make sense. It's just supposed to look weird and kinda cool and have people go away afterwards saying, hey, there's cameos in this film, you'll never guess who. One thing is worth remembering though, Flash Prime narrates the scene for us. He says worlds are collapsing into each other, universes are being wrecked, the multiversal fabric is being torn up and he did it, which is to say, the multiversal fabric is being torn up and they did it, which is to say he did it, all three of him from these three different times. He fully recognizes now the profound consequences of changing something that's personally significant but that he thought would be cosmically insignificant, something like saving his mum from being murdered. And now he has to correct this mistake and fix the timelines to save the multiverse. We've been going now for a good long while, so I don't think I'm even going to try to unpack Evil Vortex Flash's big revelation. That revelation is that he was the one who knocked Flash Prime out of the time warp initially, in order that Flash Prime meet Alt Flash and ensure that Alt Flash becomes Evil Vortex Flash. In other words, he's responsible for his own creation. But we've gone through so many paradoxes already that the words infinite paradox as he deploys them make me want some Canadian healthcare. Does it make sense? No. Doesn't matter? Fuck it, over to you, James Gunn. Flash Prime makes to leave anyway, Evil Vortex Flash goes to stab him for some batshit insane reason, Alt Flash redeems himself by jumping in the way and getting stabbed instead. He dies, meaning Evil Vortex Flash dies, though I have to point out that if Evil Vortex Flash had succeeded in stabbing Flash Prime, would not the result have been pretty much exactly the same, given what he literally just told us, because he's killed the person he has to push out of the timeline in order to create himself? And then there's a whole host of questions about what happens when a Flash dies within the time warp, because now there's no Alt Flash to go back to the last place, meaning the last place explodes, I guess, which was inevitable anyway. But then it can't be undone by Flash Prime fixing his past mistake because of retro-causality and non-parallel timelines being created by every single action. And oh fuck it, I really hate time travel. I mean, what is the consequence here? Based on the rule as established, even if he goes back and undoes his mistake, he's not saving this world because this world is an independent timeline. Moreover, it's an independent timeline which has no Flash because he's just been killed here. So yeah, 8 billion people are dead. There's nothing you can do about that. Wonder if the film will ever address it. All of this does lead, though, to what is, by some considerable distance, the strongest scene in the film, in the entire DCU, one of the strongest scenes in all superhero films. Dying Alt Flash, who isn't going to heal, I don't remember why, I don't care anymore, he gives Flash Prime the monkey bear toy their mum gave them as a kid and asks him to tell their mum that he loves her. And this he does. And the scene is really, really great. It's absolutely heartrending and tragic. The little can of tomatoes that almost brought down the multiverse forces him into the unfathomably painful position of dooming his mother to death once again. It's a brilliant, brilliant idea. It's the film's one brilliant idea. Great though it is, it's not enough to compensate for the 2 hours of nonsense we've had to go through to get to this moment, but we can appreciate it in isolation. It's conceptually heartbreaking, it's superbly performed. Flash dons a disguise and gets to have a final conversation with his mother, and she doesn't know who he is, but she does feel some preternatural attachment to him. He starts crying as he talks about his mother, to his mother, who doesn't know him but is kind and loving all the same. That's the reason he loves her. And she hugs him and consoles him and tells him how lucky his mother must be to have him. And he takes the tomatoes out of the trolley and puts them back on the shelf and says goodbye. I've been very, very hard on this film, so I think it's only right I praise it for what it does so very right here. It's one of the more impactful scenes, not just in this film, because that's a given, or even in the DCU as a whole, but in the whole bloated mess of superhero blockbusters. It's really top work. There's not a huge amount more to be said about it. I'm not sparing words in a bid to get back to the shit stuff, though that is coming, but because it doesn't really need a huge amount of explanation. It's simple, that's the point. It's very moving, it's a fitting culmination to Flash's arc in this film, which is the one thing the writers evidently wanted to get right. It's a crying shame the rest of the film doesn't come anywhere close to living up to it, but it doesn't detract too much from the scene itself. Unfortunately though, what comes next most certainly does. Barry puts the can of tomatoes back on the shelf. As he does so, he looks up. He spots the security camera. The one with the feed he tried and failed to use to give his dad an alibi. And he has an idea, and you just sit there thinking, please, no. You can't do this, don't do this. Like, everything in the film tells you can't do this, don't fuck it up like this. This film exists outside of time. It progresses nothing. It essentially uses stasis as an excuse to give Barry Allen a proper character arc, an arc that exists in a god-awful film, but a worthy arc nonetheless. He came in naive, he fucked up, he found out, he realized his mistake, he made the ultimate sacrifice, he learned his lesson. You cannot fix the past, but then, in the next fucking scene, he unlearns the lesson. He moves the cans of tomatoes to the top shelf, meaning in the present day, his dad looks up to find them and shows his face to the camera. And this is such a fucking ridiculous letdown to such a powerful piece of drama, because it means that the character arc for which everything was sacrificed, plot progression, world building, sense making, basic standards of intelligence in writing, all of it has snapped straight back to the starting point. Not only has there been no plot progression, there has, in the end, been no character progression either. The whole film was about Barry learning that some mistakes can't be fixed, some problems don't have a solution, trying to fix the past can fuck up the future. He found that out, and then he forgot it, minutes, seconds even, after he learned it. He turns up at court the next day. The security camera footage is played, his dad's face is shown, so he's exonerated. And it doesn't work on any fucking level. I'm not even convinced it doesn't break the whole footage restored by Wayne Enterprises thing mentioned back at the beginning of the film, because the pre-restored footage shown in court isn't not usable as it is. It's just a bit glitchy, but it's not completely wrecked. And since Barry has changed things up, putting the tomatoes on the top shelf to ensure his dad looked up, then believably, based upon what we're shown, his dad should never have been in prison in the first place, because the camera should always have shown his face. That's conjecture though, that's me extrapolating from about 2 seconds of pre-restoration footage that we don't get a good look at. But the result is the same either way. The Flash altered history again. This is not the old timeline, this is not home, he's created another new universe, with retro causality. Again, as he should have known, because all of that was the point of the fucking fire! It has precisely 3 effects. It makes the entirety of the preceding 2 hours utterly soul-crushingly redundant, it makes Barry Allen an unforgivably stupid prick, and it lets the film squeeze in one final cameo as Bruce Wayne's car turns up and out steps George Clooney. And that's the end of the film, save inevitably for the post-credit scene, and even that manages to cock up the last 2 hours because it shows Barry fetching a drunk Aquaman from a bar trying to get him home, only for him to fall into a puddle and lie there mumbling. Which of course means that making a slight alteration to the slight alteration he originally made has created another universe with retrocausality in which metahumans still exist, meaning Zod could have been stopped, meaning world destruction does not inevitably stem from altering the past, and at least broaching the possibility that saving his mum in a slightly different way might have created a non-doomed world in which she never died, from which he could or would, or might, maybe, return anyway. I mean, what even was the plan there again? That, though, mercifully is the end of the film. It's testament to the power of that one specific scene with his mother, and less but not insignificantly so to the 1 or 2 other bits the film got right in isolation, that I went into this review not wanting to hate it, and I still don't want to hate the film. It was, I think we're obliged to say, heartfelt. If we run with that a little bit further, it cared so much about fleshing out its protagonist that it completely forgot to make sense when doing anything else. And then it went and fucked up the one good thing it managed to create, which was Barry Allen's character arc. Ordinarily, I try, having stolen this from Mauler, to break down my conclusion in 3 distinct but overlapping categories: plot, character, and world building. But it seems pretty pointless touching on the first and third of these because they're either non-existent or unintelligible or redundant. World building is both non-existent and doubly redundant in The Flash. It's set in a redundant timeline, without much by way of internal logic or consistency, created by rules that have theoretically spawned dozens of separate alternate timelines already that the film simply wasn't aware of because it was never really a rule to begin with. It was an excuse to make things happen around its protagonist. We don't need to know what a world without metahumans would look like because it blows up anyway and we're never going back there. We don't spend enough time in the main timeline to add anything substantive to it. Batman, Flash, and Wonder Woman take out unimportant criminals who've stolen evil death virus of the week, and in that short time it kind of creates more problems than it adds worthy additions. How exactly does this team function now? Is Batman in charge? Why did he make Flash a suit that didn't have pockets for snacks? Does any of it matter? And then it's made ultimately redundant because we're not likely to revisit that in a recognizable form or in any kind of meaningful continuity once James Gunn restarts the DCU. The plot is functionally a tautology for the most part and set deliberately out of time. Within the alternate timeline, it proceeds without any real regard for its own steps and the logical progression of beats. Flash tells Bruce he wants to go back in time, Bruce says it's unfathomably dangerous and he shouldn't, even though he's already done it twice before, then Bruce fucks off, thereby ensuring that Flash does it. Having gone back to make one small change, with the plan being to return immediately thereafter, because Flash believes time is linear right up until he decides he's read all about how it isn't, he then sticks around for no conceivable reason. If we're meant to believe he thinks time is linear and he'll return home to the present to find his mother alive, he has no business staying in the ultimate timeline after evil Vortex Flash twats him out of the time warp. He has no business interrogating his former self, and yet he does. Only because he does this, for no reason, can the rest of the film happen. He has no reason to suppose, though he really should have, that saving his mum means he won't get his powers. He shouldn't have stayed. Having stayed, and having got his alternate self to get his powers anyway, and in the process of losing his own because he is an idiot, he makes no concerted attempt to recover them or to leave this timeline, even though later he decides he can just recreate the experiment to restore his powers. At a time when he believes Old Flash could possibly use his new powers to take him home, he instead decides, keenly aware of the catastrophe he's already likely caused, to stick around and fuck up the universe even more by uniting the Justice League preemptively to prevent Zod, which is a decision that cannot accord with his character, beliefs, or knowledge, but which is necessary in order that the rest of the film be allowed to happen. He discovers there are no metahumans in this world, though there's really no reason for there not to be, as confirmed in the post-credit sequence where there are. He still believes Superman might exist, though he previously decided that he didn't or couldn't. He goes to Bruce, even though he might well not be Batman in this old universe, and he isn't Batman in this universe because he retired, because Gotham is too safe, which makes no fucking sense for his character. Bruce explains one of the modern superhero genre's least sensible multiverse concepts, most of the connotations of which the film proceeds to discard. The fact that going back in time to change things creates whole new timelines with retro causality probably means the Flash has already done this twice in the Snyder Cut, yet that didn't happen apparently because the writers hadn't thought of it yet. They go to rescue Superman, who is in fact Supergirl, who hates humanity right up until the moment she doesn't. She helps Flash get his powers back and he insists on staying to fight for this one world in particular, even though the laws of the film's time travel and multiverse concepts seem to suggest this world is not the only one where his mum has been saved or could have been saved. Again, this is all done so that the rest of the plot can happen. They go and confront Zod, who was obligingly waited in the desert rather than advancing against the impossibly outmatched human adversaries, where both Bruce and Supergirl die multiple times because they are idiots. The Flashes try to fix it with time travel, but decide they can't because fate means some events, like the destruction of this world resulting from Barry saving his mother, are fixed in time across the multiverse, though this is a separate timeline, so it's highly unclear what Barry's timeline looks like as a result of his actions in this one. We learn that Old Flash and Evil Vortex Flash are the same. Evil Vortex Flash pushed Barry out of the time warp in order that he create himself, and I'm not even going to bother unpacking that one. Having finally realized his profound error, Barry corrects it, then commits a whole new one for the fuck of it. We end up where we began. And because the film made him recommit the type of mistake the whole film was nominally supposed to show him outgrowing, the only progress we made in more than 2 hours is Barry's dad is now out of prison and Bruce Wayne is George Clooney. Character is where the film undoubtedly is at its strongest, though that might be painting with too wide a brush. Barry's character development is where the film is at its strongest right up until the moment it puts a bomb under the whole thing. Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne does have a small character arc, and that's not terribly offensive, despite the nonsensical introduction to him as a washed-out hobo. Supergirl is presented as something rather more than a generic girl boss character, though given she only has half an hour to make her mark, everything about her necessarily feels rushed. Old Barry is an insufferable clown whose turn to fanatically determined time warp devil goblin is well portrayed and partially substantiated, albeit with a large number of pieces missing. Barry emerges from this film, or he did until the last scene, as a much more rounded character, the one who enjoys a proper arc, again until that last scene. His desire for a family, his desperation to fix what history broke, doesn't start from the strongest possible place, but that is the fault of earlier films. Its impact on his motives is convincing, even though the actions that result are almost invariably the worst he could possibly take in any given moment. As much as they've given him emotional depth, they have taken away his entire intellect. He is a very feeling dunce in this film. His journey, and indeed the whole film, can really be reduced to his opening scene and the scene with his mother at the end. He tries to save her, he thinks he has, he realizes he can't, he has to undo the mistake. The delivery of that scene is so powerful that it probably does elevate, perhaps unjustly, the rest of his characterization, which, though it is the strongest aspect of the film, is also deeply flawed, not least because his oft-vaunted intelligence does not match up with his dumbfuck decision-making. But again, all of this is made redundant by that stupid decision to move the tomatoes to the top shelf. The director has hinted that there were originally plans for a sequel to this film, but even that wouldn't have been able to undo the damage, because what was originally a film with a static plot and a developing character was reduced to one with a static plot and a tautological character. Progress followed by regression to the start, meaning any subsequent film would only have had to repeat the most essential lesson this film tried to convey, and that almost succeeded in conveying: that some things cannot be fixed, that you have to live with yourself, that your scars and your sadness and your grief are all a part of your character. That could have been a very potent message. Allied with the film's general lack of political preaching, we could have taken from it a generally applicable lesson. There's nothing you can do to fix the past. Attempts to fix the past invariably proceed from profound misunderstandings that will fuck up the future in dire ways, a lesson a great many people could do with hearing. It wouldn't have rescued the rest of the script by any means, but we might have looked at the last 2 hours as something other than a ludicrous waste of time. That I wanted to like the film going in, and have found myself more and more jaded by it the longer I've spent breaking it down, suggests the hope was that the audience would switch their brains off and enjoy the pretty lights, the nostalgia, and the cameos. But that's not a sustainable approach to movie making. In a post-Multiverse of Madness world, a film that shares a great many of the Flash's faults, by the way, writers should by now understand that even charitable audiences only have a limited tolerance for brainless, flashy nonsense. The Flash exceeded that limit and then some. But hey, at least we've still got Aquaman 2 to look forward to. Yeah, I'm sure that will be the pinnacle of good sense, just like the first one. See you next time, folks.